year was 1878, and the land itself felt caught in a vice. To the east, the railroad screamed, a line of iron arrogance pushing west, cutting the prairie in half. To the west, the mountains waited, old and silent, but the space between them was shrinking. This was the Texas Panhandle, or maybe it was Montana, or perhaps some piece of earth that did not yet have a proper name from the surveyors in Washington. It was Comanche land, or it had been, and now it was a wound, slowly being stitched over with homesteads and cattle trails. Dusty Ford was not a town, it was a scar. It squatted on the prairie, a collection of unpainted wooden buildings huddled against the wind. Its main street was a river of ankle-deep dust in the dry months and a churning channel of mud in the wet. It was a place of collision. Cowboys, lean and sun-cracked, pushed longhorns up from the south. Prospectors, eyes wild with fever, trickled down from the anemic gold strikes in the hills. Soldiers from the nearby fort, buttons polished but spirits dull, drank away their boredom. Railroad men, thick with sweat and curses, spent their pay on cheap whiskey and cheaper women. And through them all, silent as shadows, moved the people who had been here first. The Comanche, the Kiowa, the Arapaho. Their power was broken. The treaties signed in blood and broken in ink. But they remained, watching. Lately, a new fear had joined the old hatreds. Wolves, not the lone singers of the high ridges, but packs, or so the stories went. Packs that had grown bold, packs that did not fear men. They said the wolves had taken 3 heads of cattle from Miller's ranch, just 5 miles out. They said a mail-order bride, traveling alone on the stage, had disappeared between the depot and the town. The whispers grew, fertilized by the whiskey at the saloon and the piety at the Sunday social. The town was afraid, and a frightened town needs something to blame. Into this crucible stepped Elizabeth Hart. She had come from Philadelphia, a place of brick sidewalks, gas lamps, and civilized conversation. She was young, her face still holding the softness of the East, but her eyes held a spark of iron resolve. She had been hired by the town council, such as it was, to open a school, to bring, as she had written in her application letter, the light of education to the frontier. She believed in it. She believed in primers and blackboards, in arithmetic and in justice. She believed that knowledge could build a bridge between any two people, but her beliefs were packaged in the assumptions of her world. In her mind, civilization was a line moving west, and she was on the right side of it. The savage natives of the dime novels she had secretly read were a problem to be solved, souls to be enlightened, preferably from a safe distance. Her heart, however, was a traitor to her Eastern sensibilities. It hammered with a wild, exhilarating fear as the stagecoach rattled her closer to Dusty Ford. She was terrified of the stories, of the hard men whose eyes had raked over her at the last stop, of the sheer crushing emptiness of the land. And she was terrified, most of all, of the stories about him, the wealthy Comanche warrior, the man who was, according to her fellow passengers, more dangerous than the wolves. He was known as Chayton, sometimes as Quanah Blackhorse. He was the son of a chief, a warrior who had fought the Bluecoats until the bitter end. And then, when the end had come, he had done the unthinkable. He had not rotted on a reservation. He had adapted. He had learned the white man's tongue, the white man's law, and the white man's love of money. Now he was a landowner, a horse breeder, a cattleman. His herds were larger than those of any white rancher in the territory. He lived between two worlds, a foot in each, his heart belonging to neither. He honored the traditions of his fathers, the spirits of the land, the sacredness of the earth, and the place of the wolf within it. He also negotiated contracts with the railroad and read the financial pages from St. Louis. He was a man made of contradictions, held together by a quiet, simmering anger. He had lost his wife, his brother, and his first son in the wars. He viewed the white tide with a cold suspicion, yet he found himself haunted by a desire for a future where the children, both his and theirs, might not have to bleed for the ground they walked on. This desire was a secret he kept well guarded. Not all men in Dusty Ford were building. Some were carving. Silas Kincaid was a carver. He was a man who saw the land not as a home, But as a ledger, he was the face of the new railroad, the president of the land company, the owner of the largest cattle operation, which he ran from a plush office. Not a saddle. Wolf Valley was his prize. It was a stretch of sacred Comanche land, a place of winter shelter and ancient spirits. It was also, by a cruel twist of geography, the perfect place for a railroad depot and the head of a new cattle trail. Silas Kincaid wanted it. He was not a man who fought his own battles. He had allies. The town sheriff, a man whose pockets Kincaid lined with silver, the whiskey traders who kept the reservations pliable, and a corps of ranchers who hated any man with red skin, especially one who was richer than they were. Silas used the wolf rumors as a farmer uses manure. He cultivated them. He spread them. He magnified them. He wrote letters to the territorial governor, decrying the savage threat, both animal and human. He hinted that the Comanche were protecting the wolves, perhaps even running with them. He was building a case, not for exterminating the wolves, but for clearing out the Comanche, clearing them out, seizing the valley in the name of progress and safety. Elizabeth Hart's first sight of the schoolhouse was a sharp disappointment. It was a converted warehouse, smelling of stale grain and rat droppings, a few broken benches, a warped blackboard, and a handful of tattered books were its only furnishings. "It is not much, ma'am," the mayor, Mr. Henderson, had wheezed, avoiding her eyes. "But it is a start." She learned from the boarding house mistress, a weary woman named Mrs. Gable, that the school existed at all only because of a single, anonymous benefactor. "Just show up," Mrs. Gable said, snapping beans into a bowl. "Every few months, a package, cash, sometimes books, sent from a trading post up north. No name." Elizabeth was intrigued. A secret patron of education in a town like this, it was a piece of civilization she had not expected. She pictured a retired professor, or perhaps a wealthy widow from back east, doing her charitable duty. The truth would have stopped her heart. The benefactor was Chayton. She saw him 3 days after she arrived. She was walking down the main street, holding her bonnet against the gritty wind, when the town went quiet. It was not a sudden silence, but a draining sound. The hammering from the blacksmith's shop paused. The laughter from the saloon choked. The women gathering at the mercantile froze, their hands hovering over barrels of flour. He rode into town not like a man, but like an event. He sat on a tall black warhorse that moved with a liquid arrogance. Chayton himself was a study in jarring harmony. He wore buckskin leggings, beaded in the way of his people, but also a tailored black frock coat that must have cost a month's wages for a cowboy. A Colt revolver with an ivory grip rested on one hip. His black hair was braided, adorned with a single eagle feather, but he wore no paint. His face was the land. It was hard, cut by wind and sun and grief. He did not look at the town. He looked through it. His eyes, Elizabeth thought, were the coldest things she had ever seen. They were black, sharp, and utterly devoid of fear. He dismounted in front of the saloon, the same one Silas Kincaid used as his unofficial office. The silence stretched, thick and brittle. The men on the boardwalk, who just moments before had been full of loud boasts, suddenly found interest in their boot tips. They feared him. But Elizabeth also saw the way the saloon keeper scurrying out, nodding and bowing. They needed him, his money, his horses, his cattle. They lived in a state of half contempt and half terror. Elizabeth felt a strange pull. It was not attractive, not in the way she understood it. It was a raw, visceral awareness. He was dangerous. Everything about him screamed it, from the knife sheathed at his belt to the coiled power in his shoulders. But he was also, she admitted in a secret corner of her mind, magnificent. He was the Wild West made flesh, and he was nothing like the grunting savages in the novels. "Best you look away, dear," whispered Mrs. Gable, who had appeared at her elbow. The ranchers' wives across the street were already hissing behind their hands, their eyes like chips of ice. "That one is not for the likes of you." "Who is he?" Elizabeth asked, her voice a little breathless. Mrs. Gable's face tightened. "That is Chayton Blackhorse. He owns half the valley and thinks he owns the other half. Stay away from him. He is a wolf child, a wolf in a man's coat." The warning settled on Elizabeth's shoulders like a shroud. A wolf. The days that followed were a campaign of whispers. She heard the stories. The Comanche raid on the settlers, the scalping of the mailman. The women were stolen from their beds. The stories were always vague, the source always a friend of a friend. But they were told with a chilling certainty. Yet, what Elizabeth saw with her own eyes did not match. She saw the Comanche children. They lingered on the edge of town, their faces pressed with a silent, heartbreaking curiosity. They watched the white children play, their eyes big and dark. They stood outside the drafty window of her schoolhouse, listening to the sounds of her lessons. But they would not, or could not, come inside. She saw a few families of mixed blood, the women walking with a practiced invisibility, trying to shield their children from the stares and the muttered insults. Her Eastern certainties began to crack. She had come to teach, to bring justice. But where was the justice in a town that whispered about wolves while ignoring the hunger in a child's eyes? Who, exactly? Was the savage here? The lines were blurring. Can education build a bridge? She wondered. If one side is not allowed to cross, can a man like Chayton, a man of two worlds, exist without being torn apart by both? The questions haunted her, but she had no answers. She only had her primers and her ideals, and both felt thin and fragile against the wind of this new, hard country. The tension in Dusty Ford coiled tighter. The weather turned, a cold snap hinting at an early, brutal winter. And with the cold came a new story, a real one. This time, a freighter, his wagon, and two horses, found ripped apart on the trail from the railroad depot. The same trail Elizabeth Hart was scheduled to travel tomorrow to collect the new shipment of books, the one sent by her anonymous, civilized benefactor. The journey to the railroad depot had been tense, a straight line of anxiety under a vast, pale sky. Elizabeth had secured her boxes of primers and slates, the ones shipped all the way from Boston. Now, she was on the return. The anxiety had been replaced by a biting wind and the smell of snow in the air. She was not alone. The stagecoach was cramped, smelling of wet wool and stale whiskey. Beside her, a young woman with a face like tired porcelain clutched a sleeping toddler. Across from her sat a cowboy, his hat tipped over his eyes, a bottle held loosely in one hand, his breathing a drunken rasp. The driver, an old man named Jedediah, his face a road map of creases, sat outside, exposed to the elements, his curses at the horses snatched away by the wind. "Sky is turnin' mean, ma'am." Jedediah had called back to her at their last stop, a miserable little creek crossing. "We should make Dusty Ford by sundown, if the horses hold." But sundown was coming faster than the town. The light began to fail, draining from the sky, leaving a bruised purple and gray ceiling. A few flakes of snow, hard and dry as salt, began to sting the air. The wind picked up, moaning through the tall, dead grasses, making a sound like 1,000 whispers. The cattle they passed, huddled in gullies, seemed to watch them with a strange, unnatural stillness. "Heard 'em last night," the young mother beside her whispered, her voice trembling. She did not need to say who. "My man said they took a calf, right from the lean-to." The drunken cowboy snorted from under his hat. "Just dogs, big dogs. Nothing a little lead won't cure." He tapped the pistol on his hip. Jedediah's voice came from outside, sharp with a new tension. "They ain't dogs, you fool, and they ain't afraid of lead. Not this bunch. They're smart. Too smart." A new sound joined the wind, a low, long harmony that seemed to rise from the earth itself. A howl. It was answered by another, closer this time, and then a chorus. The horses heard it. They flattened their ears, their pace becoming ragged, skittish. Jedediah's whip cracked, a sharp counterpoint to the howls. "Get on, get!" he roared. The world outside the coach windows was a blur of gray twilight, and then shapes moved within the gray. At first, Elizabeth thought they were just shadows, pieces of the dusk come to life. But shadows did not have yellow eyes. They ran with a terrifying, fluid grace. They were huge, larger than any dog she had ever seen, their coats thick with the coming winter, their breath pluming in the cool air. And they were not circling. They were not cautious. They were running parallel to the coach. Keeping pace, a pack of a dozen or more. The young mother began to pray, a string of choked, frantic words. The baby woke and began to wail. "Light the lamps," Jedediah screamed. "Fire, they hate fire." But there was no time. The leader, a massive, dark male, lunged. It did not go for the passengers. It went for the horses. Its jaws clamped onto the haunch of the rear horse. The animal screamed, a sound of pure agony and terror that ripped through Elizabeth's soul. It reared, tearing itself from the harness. Its blood sprang black in the dim light. The coach lurched violently, throwing Elizabeth from her seat. The drunken cowboy, jolted awake, roared. He shoved his head and shoulders out the window and began to fire his pistol, not at the wolves, but into the air. The bright flashes and concussions sent the remaining horses into a blind panic. They bolted, twisting, trying to flee the new terror and the old. The world tipped. Elizabeth heard the grinding shriek of the wheel locking, the splintering of wood. The coach tilted, hung for one eternal second, and then crashed onto its side, scraping and gross across the frozen ground. Elizabeth was thrown clear. She felt a blinding, sharp impact against the side of her head as she hit a stony outcrop. The world dissolved into spinning blackness and pain. She came seconds later, or perhaps minutes. She was lying in the snow, kissing grass, her ears ringing. Her first thought was of the books. Her second, a wave of nausea. She tasted copper. She pushed herself up onto her elbows. Her head throbbed, and a sticky warmth was running into her eyebrow. The coach was a dark, broken shape, 20 yards away. One wheel spun slowly in the air. She could hear the mother screaming, a high, thin sound. The cowboy was shouting, but there were no more gunshots. And the wolves were there. They were no longer running. They were circling the wreck. Cautious now, but still bold. The smell of blood from the dead horse drove them. She saw one, its head low, creeping toward the overturned coach. Then, a set of yellow eyes found her. A wolf detached itself from the pack. It was not the leader, but it was large, and it was hungry. It walked toward her, its movements a low, patient stalk. Elizabeth froze. She was paralyzed, her limbs heavy, her mind empty of everything but the animal's unblinking, feral gaze. It was 10 feet away. 5. She could smell the raw, musky scent of it. It lowered its head, its lips pulling back in a silent snarl. It lunged. A sound split the air. Not the ragged boom of the cowboy's pistol, but a single, sharp, authoritative crack. It was deafeningly close. The wolf, in mid-leap, collapsed. It fell so close to Elizabeth that its final, shuddering breath brushed her cheek for a heartbeat. The prairie was silent. The wind, the screaming, the howling. All of it stopped. Then came a new sound, the thunder of a single horse, ridden at a full gallop. He came out of the darkness like a ghost, his form solidifying from the twilight. He was on the black war horse she had seen in town, and it moved as if it were part of him. A long, dark cape or blanket coat billowed behind him, making him seem larger than a man, a creature of shadow and wind. It was Chayton Blackhorse. The wolves turned, surprised, and met his charge. He did not slow. The big horse plunged into their midst, rearing, its hoe_Fs lashing out. Chayton shouted something, not in English, but a raw, guttural command that carried the force of a physical blow. He fired his rifle again, the flash illuminating his face, hard and impassive as carved stone. A second wolf fell. He did not stop to reload. With a fluid motion, he dropped the rifle and it swung on a strap. And in the same instant, a bow was in his hand. An arrow appeared, was drawn, and flew, sinking deep into the shoulder of a third animal. The pack, broken and terrified by this sudden, violent assault, scattered. They faded back into the dusk as quickly as they had come, but Chayton was not finished. He wheeled the horse, pulled a torch from his saddle, and with a flint and steel, struck a spark. A wad of prepared tinder caught, and he leaned down, setting fire to a high clump of dry grass. The flames roared up, a sudden wall of orange light, a definitive barrier between the living and the predators. He sat on his horse for a moment, watching the shadows, bow still in hand. Then, satisfied. He dismounted, his movements economical and precise. He walked toward Elizabeth. She was still on the ground, shaking. The image of the wolf's teeth seared into her mind. She tried to say something. "Thank you," perhaps, but her jaw trembled and no sound came out. He knelt beside her. His face was close, and she could see the cold fire in his eyes. They were not cold, she realized. They were just still, immensely still. He said nothing. His gaze swept over her, clinical and quick. He saw the gash on her temple, the way her leg was twisted beneath her. "Can you move?" His voice was low, deeper than she'd expected. It was not unkind. It was simply a question. She shook her head, which sent a new wave of dizziness through her. "I think so. My head." He nodded, as if she had confirmed something he already knew. He looked past her, at the wrecked coach. The screaming had stopped. A low moaning had taken its place. The storm, which had held its breath for the attack, was now exhausted. The wind howled, and the snow began to fall in earnest, thick and wet. "The others," she whispered. "No time," he said. His gaze was on the sky, not the wreck. "The storm is here. The town is too far." He looked back at her. For a moment, she thought he might leave her. The idea sent a spike of panic through her. "Please," she said, the word a thin thread of sound. He did not answer. Instead, he gently, but with undeniable strength, untwisted her leg. He ran a hand over her ankle, his touch surprisingly careful. He seemed satisfied she was not broken. Then, he slid one arm beneath her shoulders and the other under her knees. In one smooth motion, he lifted her from the ground. She weighed almost nothing to him. She felt a wave of profound, disorienting helplessness. Her head fell against his chest. She could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart through the thick wool of his coat and the thin cotton of her dress. She was suddenly, acutely aware of him. The scent of wood smoke, of leather, of horse, and something else. Something wild and clean. Like the snow itself, he carried her to his horse, which had stood, untethered, waiting. He mounted, settling her in front of him, her side pressed against his chest, his arm a secure band around her waist. Her feet dangled, and her head lolled against his shoulder. She was too weak, too dizzy to hold it up. She felt the warmth of his body seeping into her, a stark contrast to the ice of the wind. She was wrapped in the embrace of the savage, the wolf she had been warned against, and she had never felt so terrified, or so safe. In her life, he turned the horse, not toward Dusty Ford, but away, into the teeth of the strengthening storm, toward the dark, rising hills of the valley. She must have fainted. When she woke, the world was small, warm, and orange. She was lying on a narrow cot, covered in a thick, heavy buffalo robe. A fire burned in a stone fireplace, casting flickering shadows on a log wall. The wind was a muffled scream outside, but in here, it was still. She sat up too fast. The room spun, and she fell back, groaning. "Be still." His voice came from the shadows. She saw him then. He was sitting on a low stool by the fire, sharpening a knife. The firelight played on his high cheekbones and the dark braids of his hair. She was in a small, one-room cabin. It was, she noted with a shock of surprise, impeccably neat. The floor was swept. A stack of firewood was piled neatly by the hearth. On one wall, several large wolf pelts were stretched and drying, but on the other wall, an oil painting of a stormy sea, in a heavy gilt frame, hung over a small, tidy desk. Her eyes went to the desk. It was not the rough furniture of a frontier cabin. It was fine wood, dark and polished. On it, instead of mining picks or whiskey bottles, were books, a thick leather-bound copy of Shakespeare, a volume of English poetry, and, to her utter astonishment, a heavy tome on United States law. A stack of letters was piled neatly, one of them on stationery from the United States Army. He had not, she realized, been simply waiting on the trail. He had been tracking the coach, protecting it. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice dry. "My hunting cabin," he said, not looking up from his knife. "In the valley. The others, the baby. They are dead. He said it flatly, not cruelly, just stating a fact. The cowboy and the driver, too, the cold or the wolves. It does not matter which. Elizabeth's stomach turned. She closed her eyes, seeing the mother's tired face, hearing the baby's cry. "You should have saved them," she whispered. The accusation born of her own horror. He stopped sharpening the knife. He looked at her, and his eyes were no longer still. They were burning. "Save them," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Like your people saved mine, like your soldiers saved my wife when they burned our village, like your law saves my children from starving on land that cannot grow corn." He stood up. He was a large man, filling the small cabin with his presence. "You come here," he jested, "from your brick cities. You, with your books and your soft hands. You come to teach, to bring civilization. You want to teach my people how to live, after you have taken the land they lived on. And you ask me why I did not save 3 white people in a storm, when I could barely save 1. His words hit her like a slap. Shame, hot and sharp, flooded her. He was right. Her ideals, her mission, it all sounded so hollow, so arrogant, in the face of his raw, unfiltered grief. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. "I did not mean I am not like that." He watched her, his anger seeming to cool, replaced by a deep, weary cynicism. "It does not matter what you are like. You are here. I am here." He turned away from her, back to the fire. He picked up a tin mug, filled it with coffee from a pot warming on the hearth, and brought it to her. She took it with a trembling hand. "Thank you." He went back to the fire, but he did not sit. He stood, watching the flames. The silence stretched. "Why?" she finally asked. "Why what? Why did you save me?" "You are a teacher," he said, still not looking at her. "The children need a teacher." Elizabeth frowned. It was a strange answer. Her eyes drifted back to the desk. She saw it then, half hidden under the law book. A piece of paper, an invoice, from the shipping company in Boston. An invoice for primers, for slates, for the very books she had just tried to rescue. An invoice addressed to a post office box, with payment rendered by Q Blackhorse. He was the one, the anonymous benefactor, the savage who was funding her school. Before she could process this, he turned. He picked up a clean blanket from a shelf and tossed it to the floor near the hearth. "You take the bed," he said. "Your head hurts. I will sleep here." He was giving her his bed. After all he had said, after all the anger, he was giving her his bed. The contradiction was staggering. He spoke with the bitterness of a man who had lost everything, but he acted with a code of honor she could not deny. She watched him settle by the fire, his back to her. He was a wall, separating her from the hearth, but also, she realized, from the door, from the howling wilderness outside. The wolves had returned. Their cries filled the night, a lonely, terrifying sound. But they were outside, and she was inside, trapped in a tiny, warm room with a man who was, by all accounts, her enemy. A man who had just saved her life. A man who, she was beginning to realize, was nothing like the stories at all. She lay back, pulling the heavy robe to her chin, her mind reeling. She listened to the sound of the wind, and the sound of the wolves, and the sound of the man's steady breathing, just a few feet away, as he wrestled with his own demons in the dark. The morning broke in a silent, blinding glare. The storm had passed, leaving the world scoured clean and covered in a thin, brittle layer of snow. Elizabeth woke slowly, her mind thick and her body aching. The first thing she registered was the silence. The wind was gone. The howling had stopped. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic scrape of a whetstone on steel. She opened her eyes. The cabin was filled with the sharp, clean light of a winter morning. The fire in the hearth was low, a bed of glowing orange coals, and he was there, a dark shape against the bright, open doorway, his back to her. Chayton Blackhorse was awake and dressed. He was checking the harness on his war horse, which stood just outside, its breath a white plume in the frigid air. He moved with a quiet deliberation, his hands sure and his body economical, as if he never made a wasted motion. He was, she thought, like a part of the landscape, as silent and rooted as the trees. She pushed herself up on one elbow. and the movement sent a dull throb through her temple. The buffalo robe fell away, and she looked down. A wave of heat, sharp and scalding, flooded her body from her chest to her toes. She was not in her dress. Her dress, she now saw, was hanging from a peg near the fire, frozen stiff, its hem dark and ragged with what she knew was her own blood, mixed with the mud of the prairie. She was wearing a man's shirt. It was made of coarse, cream-colored cotton, and it was enormous, swallowing her frame, the sleeves rolling down past her hands, the hem falling to her knees. It was clean. It smelled of soap and wood smoke and a faint, masculine scent of leather. It was his shirt. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. To have put her in this, he must have taken off her dress. He had seen her. His hands had touched her. Her mind raced. Trying to reconstruct the night, he had carried her. He had tended her head. She raised a hand to her temple and felt a clean, tight bandage. His hands. In Philadelphia. This was ruined. This was the end of a woman's life. To be undressed. By a man, an unmarried man, an Indian. The word, which she had used so easily in her mind just days before, now felt foreign and dangerous. She looked at him. His broad back, the way the muscles moved under his coat as he secured a strap. He had slept on the floor. He had given her his bed. He had fed her coffee. He had saved her from the wolves. And he had, with clinical, impersonal care, undressed her, cleaned her wound, and covered her. He had not harmed her. He had treated her. She realized with a strange, twisting sense of confusion, with a profound and unspoken decency. She was ashamed, but she was also, unaccountably, safe. "You are awake." He did not turn. He spoke the words to the horse. She scrambled to sit up, pulling the robe around her, clutching the shirt at her throat. "Yes, yes." He finished his task and turned his face, as always, giving nothing away. His eyes swept over her, taking in her fear, her clutching hands. "The snow has stopped," he said. "We can leave." "My dress," she said, her voice a small, tight thing. It is useless," he said, his voice flat. "It is frozen. You will wear my coat." He gestured to the long, blanket-lined coat hanging by the door. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in her throat, eclipsing the shame. "Leave just like this. We cannot. I cannot." He raised an eyebrow. "You wish to stay here?" "No, I cannot go back to town. Not wearing this. Not with you." The words tumbled out, freighted with all the rules and fears of her old world. "Mr. Blackhorse, what will they think when I ride into town with you after being gone all night wearing your clothes? My reputation, it will be destroyed." He was still for a long moment, his black eyes fixed on her face. He was so still she wondered if he had even heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was not angry. It was colder than anger. It was a blade of pure, freezing contempt. "Your reputation," he said the words slowly, as if testing their weight. "It is more important than your life." "No!" she cried, stung to the quick. "You do not understand. You cannot understand. For a woman, back east, her good name is all she has. It is everything. Without it, I am nothing. They will not let me teach. The women will not speak to me. The men—" She stopped, choking on the implication. "They will send me back. I will have lost everything." He watched her, his expression unreadable. He had seen his own world burn to ash, his people scattered, his treaties turned to lies. And this woman, this white woman, was weeping over whispers. He saw the very real terror in her eyes, the terror of her own kind, and the contempt in his gaze softened, just barely, into a distant, weary pity. "Your world has many small, sharp knives," he said. He turned and grabbed the heavy coat. "But you cannot stay here. You are a teacher. You have children to teach." He held the coat open for her. It was a command. Trembling, she slid off the cot, the rough shirt brushing her bare knees. She felt absurdly small, a child in his presence. She slipped her arms into the coat. It was heavy as lead and blessedly warm, lined with thick wool. It smelled of him, just like the shirt. He wrapped it around her, his fingers brushing her neck as he fastened the top button. The touch was impersonal, but it sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "We ride," he said. He lifted her onto the horse first. settling her in the saddle, and then mounted behind her, his body a solid wall at her back. His arm came around her waist, holding her securely. The intimacy of it was shocking, but she was too weak and too cold to protest. He was her only anchor in a world that had suddenly become tilted and strange. He urged the horse forward, out of the small, sheltered valley and into the open. Sun-blasted snow. The ride was a blur of white and blue. The land was beautiful, but terrifying in its emptiness. About a mile from the wrecked coach, he stopped the horse. He dismounted, his moccasins making no sound on the snow. "Stay," he commanded. He walked, not to the wreck, which Elizabeth could now see in the distance. A dark, broken thing surrounded by scattered, frozen cargo. Instead, he walked to a low gully, his eyes on the ground. Elizabeth watched him. He knelt, studying the snow. He was not looking at the tracks of the wolves, which were everywhere. He was looking at something else. He stood, walked a few paces, and knelt again. He picked something up and examined it. He walked back to her, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. "What is it?" she asked. He opened his hand. In his palm lay a half-smoked cigar, and it was not waterlogged. It had been dropped recently. "Your coach did not crash by accident," he said. "What do you mean?" "The wolves. They were drawn here." He gestured with his chin toward the gully. "Someone left a dead steer down there, fresh kill, slit its throat to draw them, and—" he pointed to a set of tracks, half hidden by the new snow, but still visible. "A man's boot prints. Not a traveler, a rider's. He sat here on his horse and watched. He left this." He held up the cigar. Elizabeth's blood ran cold. "Someone lured the wolves to the road, but why?" "Why?" Chayton's laugh was a short, harsh sound. "Because the town is afraid, and a frightened town is easy to control. A frightened town will give up its land, its money, even its laws, to feel safe." He did not need to say the name. Elizabeth thought of the land company, the railroad, the man who wanted Wolf Valley, Silas Kincaid. "He was trying to create another tragedy," Chayton said, his voice flat. "To blame my people, or the wolves. It does not matter. The result is the same. Panic, and a call for soldiers." He looked at her, and his eyes were hard. "He did not plan on you surviving." He mounted the horse behind her, his arm encircling her waist with a grim, possessive strength. He spurred the horse, not toward the wreck, but directly toward Dusty Ford. They saw the town before the town saw them. It looked like a handful of dirty dice, tossed in the snow. As they got closer, a boy playing near the edge of the street looked up. His eyes went wide, and he ran screaming toward the saloon. By the time they reached the main street, it was lined. It was a repeat of the day she had first seen him, but 1,000 times worse. The town went silent. The blacksmith's hammer stopped. The curtains of the boarding house twitched, and faces appeared in the windows. He did not slow. He rode the horse on a proud, steady walk, straight down the center of the street. Elizabeth sat bolt upright, her knuckles white where she gripped the saddle horn. She could feel the stares like physical blows. A Comanche warrior, on his war horse, in his native dress, with the white, female schoolteacher. And she was not just with him. She was in his embrace. She was wearing his coat. Her hair was down, wild and matted with blood. The silence broke. A man outside the saloon let out a low, appreciative whistle, followed by a crude joke that Elizabeth heard all too clearly. She flinched, her face burning with a shame so hot it brought tears to her eyes. The women were worse. She saw Mrs. Gable on the porch of the Mercantile, her face a mask of righteous, unforgiving judgment. She saw the other wives, the ones who had warned her, turn their backs, pulling their children away as if Elizabeth herself were a disease. The sheriff stepped out of his office, his hand on his gun, his face puffed with self-importance and a mien. Low anger. "Black Horse," he shouted, stepping in front of them. "Halt right there! What in the name of what is this?" Chayton stopped the horse. He looked down at the sheriff with an expression of such profound indifference that the sheriff's face turned a darker shade of red. "I am returning Miss Hart," Chayton said, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily in the cold, still air. "The stage was attacked by wolves. The other passengers, the driver. are all dead." A murmur went through the crowd. The sheriff's eyes raked over Elizabeth, noting the coat, her disheveled state. His smile was a greasy, knowing thing. "Attacked by wolves, or did they just get in your way?" Before Chayton could answer, a new voice cut through the air. "Miss Hart Elizabeth." "Thank God we had heard we feared the worst." Silas Kincaid pushed through the crowd, his face a perfect mask of politician's concern. He was dressed in a fine wool suit, his silver hair neatly combed. He looked clean, rich, and civilized. He strode right up to the horse, ignoring Chayton completely, his hands outstretched. "My dear child, you're safe. Come down. Come down. My wife will see you. You're shaking." He reached up to help her. Chayton's arm did not move. He held Elizabeth in place, his grip like iron. He looked over her head, his eyes locking with Kincaid's. There was a silent, brutal battle waged in that stare. Kincaid, the man of money and paper. Chayton, the man of land and blood. Kincaid's smile tightened. He was a smart man. He knew when to change tactics. He turned to the gathered silent crowd. "Friends, a terrible tragedy," he announced, his voice booming. "The wolf menace has struck again. 4 more souls. Taken our prayers go out to them." He paused, letting the fear sink in. "But, by the grace of God, and the timely intervention of Mr. Blackhorse here, our brave schoolteacher has been spared." He turned back, his smile now slick and encompassing, aimed at Elizabeth. "Miss Hart, you must be in shock. But you are safe now. The town and the railroad, and I, as a humble sponsor of the school board, will take care of you." He was claiming her, in front of everyone. He was placing her under his protection, making her his asset. And then, he delivered the killing blow. "It is a true miracle," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity, as he looked from Elizabeth to Chayton and back. "That you were found. To have survived a night all alone in the frozen wilderness, well, it just goes to show. We are all deeply in your debt, Mr. Blackhorse." The words, "all alone," and "deeply in your debt," hung in the air, thick with insinuation. The men in the crowd snickered again. The women's faces hardened. He had, in one stroke, thanked Chayton, dismissed him, and branded Elizabeth as a fallen woman. Chayton saw it. He understood the move perfectly. Silas was using her shame to control her, and using the Indian to solidify his own power as the town's civilized protector. Elizabeth felt as if she had been stripped bare in the street. She was being crushed between the two of them. Kincaid, the smiling villain who had just destroyed her, and Chayton, the silent savage who had saved her, who had funded her school, who had respected her, even when she was unconscious and helpless. Her shame, which had been a hot, burning thing, suddenly crystallized. It turned into a cold, hard diamond of fury. Chayton finally moved. He leaned down, his voice low, meant only for her. "I will set you down now." He lowered her gently to the ground. Her legs were weak, and she stumbled, but she did not fall. She stood in the center of the street, in his oversized coat, and she faced the town. She turned, not to Silas Kincaid, who was still smiling, his hand outstretched. She turned to Chayton Blackhorse, who was already preparing to leave. "Thank you, Mr. Blackhorse," she said. Her voice shook, but it was clear, and it was loud. "You saved my life." The street went absolutely silent. She had not only acknowledged him, she thanked him, publicly. Silas Kincaid's smile vanished. Chayton looked down at her from the high back of his horse. He held her gaze for a long, long moment. He gave her a single, curt nod. He was turning his horse to go. "Mr. Blackhorse!" she called out, a sudden, desperate strength in her voice. He paused, his horse stamping impatiently. He turned his head. She took a step toward him, away from Silas, away from the cowering, judgmental town. "The school," she said, her voice ringing in the cold. "The one for the children. If I want to teach all the children, the white children and the Comanche children. Can I ask you for your help?" It was a gauntlet, thrown down in the dirt. She had just drawn a line in the snow, and she had stepped over it, onto his side. Silas Kincaid's face was a study in apoplectic rage. The sheriff's hand was white on the grip of his pistol. Chayton Blackhorse looked at this small, shaking, defiant woman. He saw the gash on her temple, the fear in her eyes, and the iron in her spine. He saw the teacher he had chosen, the teacher who had just chosen him. He gave his answer, his voice deep and resonant. For every person in Dusty Ford to hear. If you are still a woman who wants to talk to a man like me after today, he said, I will be there. He turned his horse, and with a single powerful kick, he was gone. A dark shape galloping out of the town, leaving a stunned silence, a gathering storm of rumor, and one single, terrified, and profoundly unbroken woman standing in his wake. The schoolhouse was as cold as a tomb. Elizabeth rang the small brass bell, and the sound died instantly, absorbed by the damp air and the dusty floorboards. 6 children. Out of a promised 30, only 6 had come. They sat on the splintered benches, their coats buttoned to their chins, their faces small and pinched with cold. There were the 3 children of the mercantile owner, the 2 sons of the blacksmith, and a small, quick girl named Tommy, a town orphan who ran errands for pennies and slept in the livery stable. She could see the others. Outside the single warped window, a small cluster of them huddled. 2 were clearly Comanche, their dark hair and wide-set eyes marking them. 3 were of mixed blood, their faces caught in a heartbreaking limbo between 2 worlds. They were hungry for learning, and she could see it. They pressed their faces to the glass, watching, but they would not come in. They were afraid, not of her, of the town. The parents, the white parents, had made their position clear after the scene on the main street. Elizabeth Hart was considered tainted. She was the Indians woman. Mrs. Gable, the boarding house landlady, no longer spoke to her, leaving her meals on a tray outside her door. The other women, the wives of the ranchers and the shopkeepers, crossed the street to avoid her, their faces tight with a mean, righteous piety. Elizabeth opened the primer. A is for apple, she read, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the half-empty room. The words felt hollow, stupid. Apples did not grow here, and the lesson in this room was not about letters. It was about fear. She closed the book. Today, she said, her voice stronger, we will not read from that book. We will have a story. The 6 children looked up. Their interest piqued. The faces at the window pressed closer. A story about the land, she said. She spoke about the great herds of buffalo, how they moved like a dark river across the prairie. She spoke of the people who followed them, who used every part of the animal, for food, for shelter, for tools. She did not say Comanche. She did not say Kiowa. She just said the people, and she spoke of them with a respect that was new to her own ears. She was teaching geography, history, and survival. The children inside were rapt. The faces at the window were still. The massive warehouse door scraped open on its rusted hinges. The sound like a groan. Chayton Blackhorse stepped inside. The cold air rushed in, swirling around his legs. He was not dressed in his fine frock coat today. He wore buckskin leggings, a heavy wool shirt, and a long coat made from a buffalo hide. The fur turned inward. He filled the doorway, a figure of raw, elemental power. He was carrying a large wooden crate on his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. The 6 children on the benches gasped. Tommy, the orphan, scrambled from her seat and hid beneath the bench, her eyes wide. Chayton did not look at them. He did not look at Elizabeth. He strode to the front of the room, his moccasins silent on the floorboards. He set the crate down with a solid, definitive thud. From his belt, he pulled a small, heavy crowbar. He began to pry the lid from the crate. The sound of splintering wood echoed in the silence. One of the boys at the window, the bravest one, a mixed-blood child with sharp, intelligent eyes, had slipped in through the open door. He stood in the shadows, watching. The lid came off. Chayton pushed it aside and plunged his hands into the straw packing. He pulled out a brand new, smooth, black slate. He set it on her desk. He pulled out another, and another. He laid out 20 slates. Then came a small, tightly sealed box. He opened it. Fresh, white sticks of chalk. Finally. From the bottom. He began to lift out the books. They were not tattered primers. They were bound in new, stiff cloth and leather. A geography of the United States, a book of sums and figures, a thick, heavy volume of Mr. Shakespeare's plays. "Look, Miss Hart," whispered the blacksmith's son, his fear evaporating. "It's books, real books. He brought them," the small boy in the shadow whispered, taking a bold step forward. "He brought the good books." The moment was shattered by a heavy, angry voice. "Miss Hart, get away from him. Children back. Get back now." The sheriff stood in the doorway, his chest puffed out, his face a mask of sweaty outrage. Behind him stood two lean ranchers, their hands on the pistols at their hips. They were Silas Kincaid's men, the children scattered, retreating to the far wall. "He is just delivering the school supplies." "Sheriff," Elizabeth said, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her voice steady. "We don't want his supplies," one of the ranchers spat, his eyes full of hate. "We don't want his kind near our children, near our women." Chayton slowly straightened up from the crate. He turned. He did not look at the sheriff or his men. He looked at Elizabeth. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were a question. "You asked for my help. Here it is. What will you do?" She knew what this was. This was the test. Her gaze went from Chayton's impassive face to the sheriff's blustering one, to the terrified, hopeful faces of the children, both inside the room and the one still peering through the window. She took a breath and stepped forward, placing herself directly between Chayton Blackhorse and the sheriff. "I am the teacher in this school. Sheriff," she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength with every word. "And these supplies are for my students. This man," she did not look away from the sheriff, "is the school's benefactor. He is the only reason these children have books to read or slates to write on. He is the only reason there is a school at all." A collective gasp came from the ranchers. The sheriff's jaw dropped. "Now," Elizabeth continued, her voice ringing in the cold air, "unless you intend to take these books away from these children, unless you intend to shut this school down, I suggest you leave us to our lessons." The sheriff was floored. He had come to bully a fallen woman and had run into a wall of iron. He looked at Chayton, who stood silent, watching, his hand resting loosely near the knife on his belt. He looked at Elizabeth, her small frame vibrating with fury. He was beaten, and he knew it. "This is irregular," he sputtered, backing up a step. "Mr. Kincaid will hear about this. Letting a savage in a schoolhouse." Chayton spoke for the first time. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the room. "He is leaving," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. The sheriff's face contorted. He looked at his two men, who suddenly seemed very interested in the ceiling. He spun on his heel, his authority in tatters. "This is not over, Blackhorse," he snarled. "And it is not over for you, ma'am. You mark my words." He and his men disappeared, slamming the door, plunging the room back into silence. Elizabeth found she was trembling, her knees weak. She turned to Chayton. "Thank you," she whispered. He was already putting the lid back on the empty crate. He nodded once, acknowledging her words. He looked past her, at the small, dark-haired boy who had crept in from the outside. The boy was now standing beside the blacksmith's son, and they were both staring at the new copy of Shakespeare, without another word. Chayton shouldered his crowbar, turned, and walked out of the schoolhouse, leaving the scent of the cold wind and the astonishing, heavy weight of his protection behind him. He came for her 2 days later. She was cleaning the slates after class, her small group of students having grown by 3. The boy from the shadows, and his 2 sisters, had come inside. They sat at the back, silent and watchful, but they were inside. He did not knock. The door just opened, and he was there. "Come," he said. "I cannot. I have—" "You want to know why they died?" he said. It was not a question. "I will show you." She grabbed her coat. This time, he had 2 horses. He helped her mount, his hand strong and impersonal on her arm. They rode out of town, not speaking, toward the setting sun. Back to the place of the wreck. The air was cold and still. He took her to the gully, the one he had inspected on their ride back. The wrecked coach was gone, salvaged for timber and iron. The dead horses had been dragged away by scavengers. But the earth, he had taught her, remembered everything. He dismounted and led her on foot. "Here," he said, pointing to the base of a thick, stubborn sagebrush. He pulled back the branches. A piece of frayed rope was tied to the root, its end cut with a knife. They tied the bait here. He led her 10 paces over, into the gully itself. There, half covered by snow and dirt, was the rotting carcass of a steer. He used his knife to flip the frozen hide. On the rump, Elizabeth saw a brand, a long, curling S and a K. "Silas Kincaid," she breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "His own herd," Chayton said, his voice flat. "A man a long way from home." He led her up the other side of the gully, to a small, rocky outcrop that gave a clear view of the road. "He waited here," Chayton said. He bent down and picked up a half-smoked, frozen cigar butt, identical to the one he had found before. He watched. He waited for the wolves to come to the bait. Then he waited for your coach. When the time was right, he and his men drove the wolves, pushed them from the easy meal toward the new one. Elizabeth felt a wave of profound, icy sickness. It was not a pack of wild animals. It was a man in a suit, a man who sat in a church pew on Sundays. "This is murder," she whispered. "He murdered those people. He calls it business," Chayton said, his voice filled with a bitterness so deep it resonated in her bones. "He wants the land. He needs the town to be afraid. He needs an enemy, the wolves, my people. It is the same thing to him. He will use his fear to make them give him the valley." She looked at him. This man, this savage, this wolf, the man the town had told her to fear. He was the only one standing between a monster and the land. He was the only one who had sought the truth. Her entire world, the one built on the simple, absolute lines of civilization and savagery, of white and red, dissolved. She saw, with a terrible bright clarity, that the real savage was Silas Kincaid. They rode back in the gathering dark. The moon was rising, a pale, scarred coin in a purple sky. He stopped at a creek, letting the horses drink. They sat in the saddle, the silence between them no longer empty, but full of a new, shared understanding. "Why did you leave the East?" he asked. His voice was quiet, stripped of its daytime harshness. She was startled by the question. "I was running," she admitted, her voice just as quiet. "From a life I did not want. My father had arranged a marriage, to a banker, a good man, a safe man. I would have been fine, but I looked at him, and I saw my entire life, every day, from breakfast to supper, for 50 years, and I knew I would rather face wolves." He was silent for a moment. Then he grunted, a sound that might have been a laugh in a different man. "Safety," he said, "is not a gift. It is a war. You must fight it every day." She found her own courage. "And you? Why did you stop fighting? Why the cattle, the money, the land deals? Why not just be a warrior?" He looked away, his profile stark against the moonlight. When he spoke, his voice was a ghost, a memory. "I was a warrior," he said. I fought your soldiers until my horse was shot from under me. I fought until I saw my brother die in my arms, his blood on my hands. I fought until they put us on the reservation, on land that was poisoned, and I watched my first son starve because the government agent sold our beef and our flour for whiskey." He picked up a pebble from the saddle horn and threw it into the dark, moving water. "I learned," he said. "The white man's law is written on paper. His God is made of gold. His spirit is in his pocket. So I learned his laws. I learned about his God. Money is the only voice he hears. It is the only weapon he respects. I will not watch my people starve again." She had no reply. There was nothing to say. They sat, two people from enemy worlds, caught in a profound, shared loneliness, and for the first time she did not feel alone at all. Silas Kincaid did not wait for the ground to thaw. The news of Elizabeth defending the Indian in her schoolhouse, followed by the sight of her riding, unchaperoned, with him into the prairie, was the only ammunition he needed. He called a town meeting that night. The saloon was packed, the air thick with smoke, whiskey, and a rising, ugly panic. Silas stood on a table, his face flushed, his voice booming with false righteousness. "Friends, neighbors, we are living in fear, the wolf pack. This unnatural plague has struck again 4 souls, lost 4 good, white souls, And what is the response? What is the answer from our leadership? He paused, letting the silence hang. I will tell you division confusion while we mourn. Our children and our children are being exposed to the very element we fear. He did not have to say her name. Every eye in the room darted to the back, where Elizabeth stood, her hands clasped, her back against the wall. We must act. We must be united. We must protect our property, our livelihood, and we must protect our women and our children. A roar of approval. I am forming a posse, he shouted, his fist raised. A hunting party, we will ride into Wolf Valley, and we will not return until every last one of those murdering beasts is a carcass in the snow. But what about the Comanche? A man yelled. They say that's their land. They won't let us hunt. Silas's face darkened. A perfect performance of controlled anger. They protect the wolves. They say they are sacred. It is their presence, their shadow that has brought this curse upon us. And now, that same shadow is in our school. It has clouded the mind of our teacher. She defends him. She rides with him. Shame, a woman shrieked from the crowd. Letting him near our children. The town was a powder keg, and Silas Kincaid held the match. The meeting broke up. The men full of whiskey and a righteous, borrowed rage. The posse would ride in 2 days, but the land would not wait. The next afternoon, the screaming started. It was not a wolf. It was a woman, Mrs. Miller, a gaunt widow who lived in a sod house on the edge of town, ran down the main street, her hair unbound, her face a mask of terror. Ben, she shrieked, collapsing in the mud. My son, my Ben. He went to find our stray cow hours ago. He is only 9. The tracks, oh God. The wolf tracks, they've taken him. The wolves have taken my boy. Ben Miller was one of Elizabeth's 6. The town exploded. It was not a rescue party. It was a lynch mob. Silas Kincaid was at its head instantly, his horse already saddled. See what your weakness has brought us? They are taking our children from our very yards. The posse rides. Now we drove to the valley. We will burn them out, the wolves, and anyone who protects them. Men grabbed rifles. They grabbed torches. They were not riding to find a lost boy. They were riding for blood. Elizabeth's heart stopped. She knew, as surely as Chayton knew, what this meant. A drunken, terrified mob, armed with torches and rifles. Riding into the sacred valley at night, they would find the Comanche, and a single, panicked shot would begin a war that would destroy the school, the children, and any chance of a future. The exact war Silas Kincaid had been planning all along. She ran. She did not think. She ran, her legs pumping, through the mud, to the mercantile. She burst through the doors. He was there, standing at the counter, calm as the mountains, negotiating the price of flour. He looked up as she burst in. His eyes narrowed, reading the terror on her face. They're gone, she panted, her words choking her. A child. Ben Miller. He's lost. Mrs. Miller's boy. The posse Silas, they're riding right now. To the valley. To your valley. They have torches. They're going to Chayton. They are going to start a war. He did not move for a heartbeat. Then he threw a heavy bag of silver coins on the counter. The sound was like a gunshot. We are finished here, he said to the stunned shopkeeper. He strode past her, out the door. She ran after him, grabbing his arm. What are you doing? Stopping a war, he said, swinging up into his saddle, his movements a blur of controlled power. You cannot go alone. They are a mob. They will kill you. This is not your fight. Schoolteacher, he said, gathering the reins. He is my student. She screamed, her voice tearing from her throat, raw and desperate. Ben is my student. I am not just a victim. I am not just the woman you saved. I am coming with you. He paused. He looked down at her, this small, furious, terrified woman from the east, her face streaked with tears and dirt, her eyes blazing with a fire that matched his own. He saw her, not as a white woman, not as a fragile teacher. He saw her as she was. A flicker of something, not a smile, but a deep, profound respect, moved in his eyes. You cannot ride in that dress, he said, his voice a low growl. The stable. My spare horse is there. Get the stable boys extra trousers. You have 10 minutes. Meet me at the Cottonwood Creek. If you are not there, I will go without you. He did not wait for her answer. He struck his heels to the horse, and he was gone. A dark streak against the dying, blood-red sun. riding to stop a war. Elizabeth did not hesitate. She ran for the stable. She was there in 9 minutes. The stable boy, a youth whose chin was still smooth, stared at her as if she were a ghost, his eyes wide with terror as she demanded, and paid $2 silver for a pair of his cleanest wool trousers and his spare horse. The trousers were baggy, held up with a piece of rope. The horse was a bony mare, but it was enough. She rode, not as she had been taught in Philadelphia, side saddle and demure, but hard, astride the horse like a man, her skirts bunched around her waist, the rough trousers a scandalous, wonderful secret beneath them. She beat the cold wind to the Cottonwood Creek and found him waiting, a dark statue against the dying light. He did not speak. He did not remark on her appearance, or her speed, or the wildness in her eyes. He simply looked at her, and in his gaze she saw the barest flicker of something, acknowledgement. He turned his great black horse and pointed its nose toward the hills. "We stay on the ridges. We will be faster than their torches." He led her into the valley, his valley, and it was as if they had passed through a door into another world. The land was no longer the flat, brutal prairie of the town. This was a land of shadows, of hollows, of ancient, sleeping spirits. He moved through it not like a man, but like a part of the darkness, his horse's hooves making no sound on the pine needles. He was not tracking the mob. He was tracking the boy. He found the trail in a place no white man would have looked. A single, small, scuffed boot print in a patch of mud near a game trail. He was running, Chayton said, his voice a low breath. He was following a rabbit, and then he was lost. They followed the tiny, wandering tracks for what felt like hours, the moon a sliver of ice in the black sky. The lights of the posse were a smear of angry orange. Far to the south, and receding, they were going in the wrong direction, toward the open valley, toward Chayton's main ranch, toward a confrontation. Chayton stopped, his hand raised. "Listen," he breathed. Elizabeth strained her ears, the wind, the skittering of a night animal, and then a sound that froze her blood, a child's sob, thin, high, and desperate. It was answered by a low, rumbling growl. Chayton was off his horse in an instant, a silent shadow. "Stay here. Stay with the horses." "No," she said, sliding off the bony mare, her legs trembling but holding. "He is my student. I am coming." She did not wait for his answer, but followed him, stumbling. Through the dark, he led her to a place where the earth fell away, a rocky crevice, a small canyon carved by ancient water. They found Ben. He was wedged on a narrow ledge, perhaps 10 feet down, having slipped and fallen. His face was a white blur of terror, his small body shaking. He was crying, his sobs muffled by his coat. On the ledge with him, and in the rocks below, were the wolves. It was a small pack, a family, a mother, a father, and 2 yearlings. They were not the frenzied, manipulated monsters from the stagecoach. They were simply wild animals, curious and defending their territory. One of the yearlings, bold, was creeping along the ledge toward the crying boy. Ben saw them. He screamed, a raw sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Before Elizabeth could even think, Chayton acted. He did not reach for his rifle. He grabbed a handful of dry, stringy fungus from a dead tree. He pulled a small leather pouch from his belt. He put a pinch of something in his mouth and let out a sound. It was not a human sound. It was a low, guttural, long call, half whistle, half growl. The wolves froze. The bold yearling stopped, its head cocked, confused. The sound was not a challenge. It was something else, something that did not belong. As they hesitated, Chayton struck a flint and steel into the dry fungus. It caught, not with a flame, but with a thick, pungent, acrid smoke. He dropped the smoking mass onto the ledge just below them. The wind caught the smoke and swirled it around the animals. Wolves fear 2 things above all the unknown, and fire. This smelled of both. The mother let out a sharp, warning bark. The yearling scrambled back. The pack, unnerved by the strange, choking smell and the unearthly call, turned as one and melted back into the shadows. "Ben!" Elizabeth cried, her voice desperate. "Ben! It is Miss Hart! We are here!" The boy was paralyzed, his eyes locked on the shadows where the wolves had been. He would not move. "I have to go down," Elizabeth said. "It is too steep," Chayton said, his hand grabbing her arm. "He must climb up." "He cannot. He is frozen with fear." She looked at the narrow, crumbling ledge. "I am smaller. I can reach him." She did not wait for his permission. She wrenched her arm free and slid down the embankment, her boots sending a shower of loose rock and dirt. She landed on the ledge, her knees buckling. "Ben," she said, her voice a low, soothing croon as she crawled toward him. "It is all right. It is me, Miss Hart. The wolves are gone. He made them go." She reached the boy. He was tiny, his body radiating a strange, dry heat. She grabbed his coat. "Come, Ben, we are going home." She half dragged, half carried him back to the embankment. Chayton lay flat on the rim, his arms stretched down. He grabbed the boy's coat and pulled, lifting the child from her arms as if he were a doll. Then his hand clamped onto her wrist. "Come," he said, and with one powerful, fluid pull, he hauled her up, out of the darkness and onto the solid ground. The moment she was safe, the world, which had held its breath, exhaled. The wind, which had been a breeze, struck them like a fist. The sky, which had been clear, opened. A freezing, driving rain, mixed with sleet, began to fall. The storm was here. Ben, his terror fading, was suddenly overwhelmed by the cold. He began to shiver violently, his teeth chattering, his body going limp in Chayton's arms. Elizabeth looked at Chayton, her face a question. "The town," she shouted over the wind. "The posse, we have to—" "We will do nothing," he shouted back, his voice a low roar. He was already striding toward his horse. The boy held against his chest. "The town is 10 miles. The boy is sick. He will be dead before we are halfway." He looked at her, his eyes unreadable in the dark. "My cabin is 1 mile. We will go there." They rode, not as 2, but as 3. Chayton held the now barely conscious boy in front of him, wrapped inside his greatcoat. Elizabeth rode beside them, her head bowed against the stinging, icy rain. The cabin, when they reached it, was not a shelter. It was a miracle. Chayton kicked the door open, strode in, and deposited Ben on the narrow cot. He was already barking commands. "Bolt the door. There is tinder in the box. Light the lamps." Elizabeth's hands were numb, but she moved. She fumbled with the bolt, her fingers like wood. She found the tinder, struck a match, and a low, orange glow filled the small room. Pushing back the raging, screaming dark, Ben was not just shivering, he was burning. His face was flushed, his lips cracked, and he was muttering, his words slurred and nonsensical. "He has a fever," Elizabeth said, her hand on the boy's forehead. "It is cold. The fright." Chayton was at the hearth, his movements quick and sure, building a fire with an expert's economy. Within minutes, a robust, crackling blaze was fighting the cabin's chill. He did not stop. He went to a small, dark cabinet, pulled out a tin mug, a small pot, and a leather pouch. He filled the pot with water from a cask and set it in the embers. He opened the pouch, and a sharp, herbal scent cut through the air. He added a pinch of dark leaves and dried berries to the mug. Elizabeth sat on the cot, pulling the single rough blanket over Ben, trying to stop his shivers, her heart twisting at his small, delirious groans. She was a teacher. She was supposed to know what to do. She felt useless. Chayton came to the bed. The water in the pot was now steaming. He poured it into the mug, and the herbal scent intensified. He knelt by the bed, the mug in his hand. "He must drink this," he said. Elizabeth looked at the dark, steaming liquid with suspicion. "What is it?" "Willow bark and berry root. It is what my people use. It will break the fever. It will stop the pain." She hesitated. He was the savage. This was the Indian medicine she had heard whispers of. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice quiet, but with a new, sharp edge. "There is no white doctor here. There is only me, and the storm. You must trust me." She looked from his hard, unblinking eyes to Ben's small, suffering face. She nodded. "Help me." Together, they raised the boy. Chayton held his head, and Elizabeth held the mug to his lips. "Drink, Ben. It is all right. You must drink." They forced the bitter, hot liquid into him, drop by drop. He coughed, he sputtered, but he drank. Finally, Chayton laid him back down, and Elizabeth covered him, wiping the sweat and rain from his face. The boy's delirious eyes found Chayton's dark, tall form, standing by the fire. He whimpered, his small hand gripping Elizabeth's. "Miss Hart," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Is that him, the bad man, the one my pa says is a wolf?" Elizabeth's heart shattered. She leaned close, her own tears blurring her vision. "No, Ben," she whispered, stroking his hair. "He is not a bad man. He is the man who found you. He is the man who saved us." Ben's eyes, full of a child's profound, simple logic, drifted back to Chayton. I don't think he's bad." His eyes fluttered, and, for the first time, he fell into a deep, quiet sleep. The storm was a solid wall of sound, a screaming, primal roar. But inside the cabin, there was a new silence. The fire crackled. The boy breathed, his small chest rising and falling in a steady, even rhythm. Elizabeth sat on the low stool Chayton had used the night before, her body numb with exhaustion. Chayton stood by the fireplace, his back to her, a solid, unmoving wall of muscle and shadow. "The fever is breaking," he said. His voice was a low rumble, just beneath the sound of the wind. "Thank you," she said. It was not enough. The words were small and useless. "You saved him." "We saved him," he corrected, still not turning. The silence returned, but it was charged. It was full of everything unsaid. The ride, the rescue, the child, the town, the night before. "They will not believe it," Elizabeth said, her voice a low murmur. "They will not believe you saved him. They will twist it." "Let them," he said. "And me," she said, her voice catching. "What will they say of me, here, again, with you, in your cabin?" He turned then. His face was a mask of shadows and firelight, his black eyes unreadable. "Does it matter what they say?" "It matters," she cried, the exhaustion and fear bubbling over into anger. "It matters to me. I have lost everything, my reputation, my school, my place, all because you did what was right," he finished for her, his voice dangerously soft. "And you," she shot back, standing, her small frame vibrating with a sudden, wild energy. "Does it not matter to you? You are afraid. Too, you hide behind your money, your land, and your coldness. But you are just as afraid as I am. You are afraid of losing this valley. You are afraid of losing anything, ever again." He strode across the 2 feet of floor that separated them. He was a mountain of fury, towering over her. "You know nothing of my fear," he growled, his voice a low, lethal thing. "I know you," she said, her own voice shaking, but she did not retreat. She held her ground. Her hands were fisted at her sides. "I know a man who buys books for children he has never met. I know the man who came for me in a wolf pack. I know the man who slept on the floor so I could have his bed. I know the man who just saved my student's life. Do not tell me I know nothing." He stared down at her, his chest heaving, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped. He was at war, not with her, but with himself. He saw her, not as a white woman, not as a fragile teacher, but as the one person on this earth who had seen all of him, the man and the ghost, and had not run. His hand came up, slow, heavy, as if lifting a great weight, his rough, calloused fingers, the fingers of a warrior, of a horseman, of a survivor. Touched her face. They did not grab. They did not take it. They explored, tracing the line of her jaw, the soft curve of her cheek, with a tenderness that unraveled her. "Elizabeth," he breathed her name. It was the first time. It was a surrender. "Chayton," she whispered. He leaned down, and he kissed her. It was not a kiss of civility. It was not a kiss of polite, Eastern restraint. It was a kiss of the storm, of the fire, of the wild, lonely land they stood on. It was slow, at first, a question asked in a language neither of them knew they spoke. It tasted of wood smoke, and rain, and a decade of his grief, and a lifetime of her loneliness. She did not pull away. Her body, which had been coiled tight with fear, melted. Her hands, which had been fists, opened. They came up, sliding up his chest, gripping his arms. holding on, not for safety, but as an anchor. The kiss deepened. It was no longer a question. It was the answer. It was a raw, desperate claim, a hunger, not of the flesh, but of the spirit. He was the one thing in this world that made sense. She was the one thing in his that he could not, would not, lose. He broke the kiss, his breathing a harsh, ragged sound. His forehead rested against hers. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of pain and need, and a terrifying, dawning hope. "If we do this," he whispered, his voice rough, "there is no going back. Not for you. They will crucify you." "They already have," she whispered back, her fingers tracing the hard line of his mouth. "They already see the harlot. They already hate me. Let them. I am not afraid of them. Only to be alone again." He looked at her then, his eyes open, and she saw it all. The warrior, the landowner, the grieving husband, the man. He lifted her, as he had on the prairie. He lifted her into his arms. But this time, it was not a rescue. It was a choice. Her choice, his choice. He carried her to the narrow cot, in the midst of the storm, as the wind howled its grief to the mountains. They found their own refuge. It was not a savage, desperate taking. It was a slow, deliberate, and profound giving. It was healing. For her, it was a defiant tearing down of every rule that had ever sought to bind her, a discovery of a strength, a passion she never knew she had. For him, it was a breach in a fortress of loss he had spent years building, a painful, terrifying, and necessary surrender. It was the whisper of a new beginning, a promise made not in words, but in the silent, desperate, and beautiful language of the heart. The wind screamed, but in the cabin, there was, for a few hours, no war, no past, no future. There was only the fire and the rain, and the two of them, breathing as one. The dawn came, cold and gray. The storm had passed, leaving an exhausted silence. Elizabeth woke first. She was in the cot, alone, covered by the heavy buffalo robe. Ben was sleeping peacefully, his breathing even, his skin cool. Chayton was at the fire, his back to her, adding a log. A wave of joy, so pure and sharp it was a pain, washed over her. It was followed, instantly, by a cold, hard spike of terror. The world rushed back in. Philadelphia, the town, the whispers. Mrs. Gable, Silas Kincaid. She was, in truth, ruined. "The fever is broken," he said. His voice was flat, dead. "Chayton," she whispered, sitting up, clutching the robe to her chest. He turned. His face was a mask, harder, colder than she had ever seen it. The warrior was back, the walls rebuilt. "You must go," he said, his voice void of all emotion. "What?" "I will take the boy back to his mother. You will go east. I will give you the money. You can tell them I held you captive, that you escaped. You will be a hero. You can begin again." He was offering her an escape, an honorable discharge from a war he had not asked her to fight. She stared at him, uncomprehending, and then she saw it. The struggle. This was not cold. This was a sacrifice. He was trying to protect her, to save her from his world, from the consequences of his own heart. She stood up, the robe dragging on the floor. She did not care that she was bare beneath it. She walked to him, across the cold floor, until she was standing directly in front of him. "No," she said. His jaw tightened. "Elizabeth, you do not understand. I will not be the man who destroys you. I have lost enough. I will not be responsible for your ruin." "My ruin," she said, her voice quiet, but with an edge of steel he had not heard before. "My ruin was a drawing room in Philadelphia. My ruin was a life of nothing. What happened in this cabin was not my ruin. It was my salvation." She placed her hand flat on his chest. She could feel the steady, hard beat of his heart. "I am not leaving. I am not running. I am not pretending that last night did not happen. It did, and it was real. The town has rules. That is a lie." He looked down at her, his heart a raw, open wound. "It is not that simple," he whispered, his defenses crumbling. "It is that simple," she said, her eyes locked on his. We cannot tell them. Not yet. Not while Silas holds the town in his hand. We have a fight to win, We have to save this valley. We have to save the town from him. After that, we will face them. We will face them together." He searched her face, seeing not the fragile teacher, but a woman as strong as the mountains, a woman forged in the fire of the West, a woman who was, in every way, his equal. He covered her hand with his own. He did not speak. He just nodded, once, a slow, binding promise. They rode back into Dusty Ford in the full, bright light of morning. Chayton rode in front, the sleeping Ben Miller held tenderly in his arms. Elizabeth rode beside him, her head high, the men's trousers hidden by her long coat, her face set. The town was there. The posse, muddy, exhausted, and ashamed, had just straggled in, empty-handed. Mrs. Miller saw them. A sound, half scream, half sob, tore from her throat. "Ben, my boy, he is alive." She ran, stumbling, and Chayton dismounted, placing the sleeping child in his mother's arms. The crowd was frozen, caught between gratitude and a deep, ingrained suspicion. They were heroes, but they were them. Silas Kincaid stepped out from the porch of the saloon. His face was not grateful. It was a mask of cold, assessing fury. He had lost his mob. He had lost his excuse for war. He needed a new one. "A miracle," he boomed, his voice dripping with venom. "A true miracle. How fortunate that Mr. Blackhorse knew exactly where to find the boy." He paused, letting the silence grow heavy. "It is almost," he continued, his voice a sly, conspiratorial whisper, as if he knew where the wolves would be. How convenient that the man who protects the wolves is also the only one who can call them off. The gratitude in the crowd died, replaced by a new, cold, and terrible suspicion. Elizabeth and Chayton stood side by side, the sleeping child their only proof, and said nothing. The rescue was over. The war had just begun. The peace that had settled over Dusty Ford was as fragile as new ice, and Silas Kincaid shattered it 3 nights later. The victim was Jebediah Stone, a cattleman known for his loud voice, his heavy hand with a branding iron, and his fierce loyalty to Kincaid's land company. He was found at dawn, face down in the mud of his own corral, not 2 miles from the edge of Wolf Valley. The scene was a grotesque theater of violence. Stone's throat had been torn out, the jagged wounds consistent with the jaws of a large predator. But there were other marks, deep, clean slices in his coat and chest that looked less like teeth and more like the work of a heavy blade. And around the body, pressed clearly into the softening mud, were tracks, not the prints of a boot, but the distinct, soft-soled shape of a Comanche moccasin. By noon, the story had spread through the town like a fever. They said Stone had been in a dispute with Chayton Blackhorse over grazing rights near the creek. They said Chayton had threatened him. They said the savage had finally tired of pretending to be a white man and had sent his wolves and his warriors to do his killing. The sheriff did not wait for an investigation. He rode out to Chayton's ranch with 12 armed deputies and a warrant signed by the town judge, who was also Kincaid's brother-in-law. Elizabeth heard the news from Tommy. The girl burst into the schoolhouse, her face pale beneath the dirt. "They are going to the big house," Tommy gasped, her small chest heaving. "The sheriff and the men. They say Mr. Blackhorse killed Jeb Stone. They are going to take him." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. She dropped her chalk. "Stay here," she commanded the children. "Do not leave this room." She ran. She did not have a horse, so she ran toward the sheriff's office, hoping to stop them. But she was too late. The dust of their departure was already settling on the road. At the Blackhorse Ranch, the scene was balanced on the edge of a massacre. The sheriff and his men sat on their horses, rifles leveled. Arrayed against them were Chayton's ranch hands, Comanche men, veterans of the Plains Wars who had dropped their pitchforks and picked up Winchester rifles. They stood in a line, silent and lethal, ready to die for the man who had given them a home. Chayton stood on the porch of his main house. He wore his work clothes, a simple linen shirt and canvas trousers. He looked at the sheriff, then at the nervous deputies, and finally at his own men. "Stand down," Chayton ordered, his voice carrying over the wind. "He comes to chain you, Quana," one of the older Comanche hands shouted, using Chayton's native name. "We will not let him take you. If you fire, Chayton said, his eyes hard. "They will bring the army. They will burn this valley and everyone in it. Stand down. That is an order." Reluctantly, slowly, the ranch hands lowered their weapons. The sheriff dismounted, his face slick with sweat and triumph. He walked up the steps, his spurs jingling. "Chayton Blackhorse," he announced. "You are under arrest for the murder of Jebediah Stone." "I was here all night," Chayton said calmly. "My men can testify. Your men are Indians." The sheriff spat. "Their word is worth nothing in a court. Besides, we found this." He signaled to a deputy, who reached into a saddlebag and pulled out a heavy, silver pocket watch. He tossed it onto the porch. It was Jeb Stone's watch, found it in your saddlebag in the barn. The deputy lied, his eyes shifting away. Wrapped in a fresh wolf pelt. It was a plant. It was clumsy, obvious, and utterly damning. Chayton looked at the watch, then at the sheriff. He saw the trap closing. If he resisted, he died, and his people died. If he went, he faced a white man's court. He held out his hands. The sheriff smiled and snapped the iron cuffs onto Chayton's wrists. The sound of the metal clicking shut echoed across the yard, a sound of finality that reminded Chayton of the day he had surrendered to the soldiers years ago. He walked to the sheriff's horse, his head high, refusing to look at the ground. Back in town, Elizabeth was fighting her own battle. The atmosphere in Dusty Fort had turned poisonous. The goodwill she had earned by saving Ben Miller had evaporated, replaced by the old, deep-seated fear. Mrs. Gable stopped her on the stairs of the boarding house. "You cannot stay here," the landlady said, her arms crossed. "Not if you are going to support that murderer. I run a respectable house. I will not have the town thinking I harbor sympathizers." "He is innocent," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling with frustration. "Mrs. Gable, you know him. He bought the books for the school. He saved the Miller boy." "He is a savage," Mrs. Gable said, her face closing like a stone door. "And it seems he has bewitched you. You have until sundown to move your things." Elizabeth walked out into the street. People turned away from her. The mother of one of her students grabbed her child and hurried to the other side of the road. The message was clear. Cut him loose, or drown with him. It would be so easy. A treacherous voice whispered in her mind. "Pack your bags. Take the stagecoach east. Leave the dust, the wolves, and the impossible love behind. You can be Elizabeth Hart, the respectable spinster teacher, again." She looked toward the jailhouse, a brick building with iron bars on the small windows. She thought of the night in the cabin, the heat of the fire, the weight of his hand on her face, the promise they had made without words. She was not that woman anymore. She straightened her spine and walked toward the saloon, where Silas Kincaid had called a town meeting. The saloon was packed to the rafters. Smoke hung heavy in the air, mixing with the smell of unwashed bodies and cheap whiskey. Silas stood on a makeshift platform of crates, his face grave, his eyes alight with the fire of a preacher condemning the damned. "We gave him a chance," Silas roared. "We let him walk among us. We let him buy land, and how does he repay us? By slaughtering a good man in the dark, by sending his beasts to tear out the throat of a Christian. Hang him," a voice shouted from the back. "Burn him out," cried another. "We cannot wait for a judge from the city." Silas continued, leaning forward. "Justice delayed is justice denied. The Bible says an eye for an eye. I say we take justice into our own hands." Tonight the crowd roared its agreement, a single terrifying beast of mob violence. "Stop." The word was not a shout, but it was sharp enough to cut through the noise. Elizabeth pushed her way through the crowd. Men grumbled and shoved back, but they made way for her. She climbed onto a chair near the bar, making herself visible to everyone. "Elizabeth," Silas said, his voice dripping with a patronizing pity. "This is no place for a lady. Go home." "I will not," Elizabeth said. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst, but her voice was steady. "You are lying, Mr. Kincaid, and you are leading these men to commit murder." The room went silent. "Murder," Silas chuckled. "We are talking about justice." "My dear, justice relies on truth," Elizabeth said, looking out at the faces of the men she knew. The blacksmith, the baker, the fathers of her students. "You say he killed Mr. Stone with wolves, yet you also say there were knife wounds. Why would a man who commands wolves need a knife?" Why would he leave tracks that are perfectly clear when he can walk through the woods without snapping a twig? Why would he leave a watch in his own barn? He is arrogant, Silas snapped. He thought he could get away with it because he is rich. He is not arrogant, Elizabeth countered. He is generous. He bought the books for your children when the town council would not spend a dime. He rode into a storm to save Ben Miller when you... She pointed a shaking finger at Silas. We're busy gathering a posse to hunt innocent animals. He saved the boy to hide his guilt. Silas shouted, losing his composure. He saved the boy because he is a good man, Elizabeth cried. Better than any man here who stands ready to hang him without a trial. The crowd shifted. They were wavering. Her words had struck a chord. They remembered the books. They remembered the boy. Silas saw he was losing them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his last, dirtiest weapon. A good man, Silas sneered. He looked at the crowd, his expression changing to one of mock sorrow. It breaks my heart to say this, truly. But perhaps Miss Hart is not the best judge of character. Perhaps her judgment has been clouded. He looked directly at Elizabeth. Tell us, Miss Hart, where did you spend the night of the snowstorm? Was it not in his cabin? Was it not in his bed? The room gasped. The insinuation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She slept with the Indian. A woman whispered loudly near the door. She is his whore, a man muttered. Silas smiled. You defend him not because he is innocent, but because you have given him your virtue. You have let him soil you. Your word means nothing. Elizabeth felt the shame rise, hot and burning. She saw the disgust in the eyes of the town. She saw her reputation, her career, her future, turning to ash. She could deny it. She could say she slept on the floor. She could say he was a gentleman. She looked at Silas, and she saw the fear behind his eyes. He was afraid of the truth. Elizabeth lifted her chin. She did not look at the floor. She looked straight at Silas Kincaid. Where I slept, she said, her voice clear and ringing, and who I love is a matter for my heart and my God. It does not change the facts of a murder, and it does not change the fact that you are a thief and a liar who is trying to steal his land. She had not denied it. She had not apologized. The shock in the room was absolute. A woman, a schoolteacher, admitting to loving a Comanche. It was unheard of. It was scandalous. And it was incredibly brave. Silas opened his mouth to speak, to twist the knife further. But the saloon door swung open with a crash. A tall man in a dark duster coat stood there. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and carried a Winchester rifle in the crook of his arm. On his chest, a silver star caught the light. That is enough, the man said. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of federal iron. Who are you? Silas demanded. I am Captain Davis, the man said, stepping into the room. United States Marshal. I was passing through on my way to Fort Smith when I heard there was a hanging party forming. He walked to the front of the room, his eyes scanning the crowd. There will be no hanging tonight. There will be no mob justice. This is a local matter. Marshal, the sheriff said, stepping forward, his hand near his gun. Murder is a local matter, Marshal Davis said coolly. But when the accused is a prominent landowner with federal treaties, and the accuser, he glanced at Silas, is under investigation for land fraud in 3 territories, well, then it becomes my matter. Silas paled. I am taking custody of the prisoner, Davis announced. He will stay in the jailhouse until I can conduct a proper investigation. If he is guilty, he will hang, but he will hang by the law, not by the rope of a land grabber. He looked at the sheriff. Unlock the cell. I will keep the key. The mob dissolved, grumbling but cowed by the marshal's presence. Silas Kincaid stormed out, his face a mask of fury. Elizabeth sagged against the bar, her legs finally giving out. Later that night, Elizabeth went to the jailhouse. Marshal Davis, a man with kind eyes and a hard face. Let her in. 5 minutes. Ma'am, he said, he is lucky to have you. That was a brave thing you did. She walked to the cell. Chayton was sitting on the cot, his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. He stood and walked to the bars. He looked tired, his face drawn, but his eyes were burning with a desperate intensity. You should not have come, he said. His voice was rough. You should not have spoken. I told the truth, she said, reaching through the bars. He did not take her hand. He stepped back, putting distance between them. You destroyed yourself, he said. I heard what Silas said. I heard what you answered. You have admitted it to them. They will never let you teach again. They will treat you like a leper. I do not care, she said. I care, he shouted, the sound echoing off the stone walls. He gripped the bars, his knuckles white. I tried to save you. I tried to send you away. Why do you not listen? You must go. Pack your things. Go back to Philadelphia. Leave this place. Leave me. No, she said. Elizabeth, he pleaded, his voice cracking. Look at me. I am a man in a cage. I am a Comanche in a white man's town. I am a dead man walking. Silas will not stop. If the law does not kill me, he will find another way. I cannot protect you from inside here. If you stay, you will only watch me die. If I leave, she said, stepping close to the bars, pressing her body against the cold iron. I will be safe. I will have my reputation. I will have a dull, gray life where I am safe and respected and completely empty. She reached through and grabbed the lapels of his shirt, pulling him toward her. I am not that woman anymore. Chayton, you woke me up, in the snow, in the cabin. You gave me myself. If I leave you now, I leave the best part of me behind. I would rather be a ruin in Dusty Ford than a ghost in Philadelphia. He stared at her, his resistance shattering under the force of her loyalty. He reached through the bars and cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away the tears she did not know she was shedding. You are a foolish woman, he whispered, his forehead resting against the bars. And you are a stubborn man, she whispered back. They stood there in the silence of the jail, separated by iron but bound by something stronger. Silas will not wait for the investigation, Chayton said quietly. He knows the evidence is fake. He knows the marshal will find the truth about the tracks. He has to act fast. What will he do? He will try to move me, or he will have me killed in the cell. He cannot let me stand trial. Then we must be ready, Elizabeth said. I am not alone, she said. Tommy is watching the street. Mr. Henderson, the baker, slipped me a note of support. There are people, Chayton, not many, but some. They are tired of Silas too. Go to them, Chayton said, but be careful. The wolf is cornered. That is when he bites. Marshal Davis knocked on the door. Time is up, miss. Elizabeth squeezed Chayton's hand one last time. I will not let them take you. She walked out into the night. The air was cold, but clear. She met Tommy in the alley behind the mercantile. The girl was shivering, pulling a ragged shawl tight. Miss Hart, Tommy whispered. I heard them. At the livery stable. Silas's men. They are talking about a transfer. A transfer. They are going to tell the marshal that there is a threat of a new mob. They will offer to move Mr. Black Horse to the county seat for safety, tomorrow night. And then they said the road to the county seat goes through the canyon, Tommy said, her eyes wide. They said he will try to escape, and they will have to shoot him. Elizabeth felt a cold resolve settle in her stomach. It was the shot while escaping trick. It was a death sentence. Thank you, Tommy, Elizabeth said. She reached into her pocket and gave the girl a coin. Go find the blacksmith's son. Tell him I need to speak to his father. Tonight. What are we going to do? Miss Hart, Tommy asked. Elizabeth looked at the jailhouse, then at the dark outline of the hills where the free wolves ran. We are going to break the law, Elizabeth said, to save justice. The plan was desperate, and it was hers. Elizabeth, who had once fainted at the sight of a mouse in Philadelphia, now stood in a lightless alley, planning a jailbreak. The fire must be big. The blacksmith, Mr. Henderson, said, his voice a low rumble. He was a large, quiet man who had watched Silas Kincaid's greed poison the town for too long. It has to pull every man, not just the sheriff, but the marshal, too. The old livery stable, Elizabeth said, her voice quiet but firm. It is full of dry hay, and Kincaid owns it. It is insured for twice its worth. He will be the first one to panic. And the key, the blacksmith asked. Tommy, Elizabeth said, looking at the small, ragged orphan who had become her eyes and ears. You are the only one small enough to get to the back window without being seen. Can you do it? Tommy nodded, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with a fierce, adult gravity. I can get this for him. She held up the object the blacksmith had just given her, a thin, hard steel file, small enough to be hidden in a fist. The night was moonless, thick with the smell of an approaching storm. The air was heavy. Still, a coiled spring. At precisely 2 o'clock in the morning, a cry went up. "Fire! Fire at the livery!" The town exploded. Men tumbled out of the saloon, shouting. The sheriff's office door burst open. Elizabeth watched from the shadows as the sheriff, his deputies, and finally, after a moment's hesitation, Marshal Davis ran toward the orange glow that was beginning to eat the sky. The livery stable, the symbol of Kincaid's inflated power, was burning. "Now," Elizabeth whispered. Tommy moved like a wisp of smoke. She slipped from the alley, staying in the deepest shadows, her bare feet silent on the dusty street. She went behind the jailhouse, to the one small barred window at the back of Chayton's cell. Chayton was not sleeping. He was standing at the bars, waiting, as if he had known she would come. "Mr. Blackhorse," Tommy whispered, her small hand reaching through the bars. "Miss Hart sent this. She said the fire was a diversion. She said you must hurry." His large, warm hand closed over the file, his fingers brushing hers. "Tell her," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "To ride. Tell her to ride for the ranch. Do not wait for me. Go, now!" Tommy nodded and was gone. A shadow swallowed by shadows. Chayton worked with a focused, desperate speed. The file was good steel, the blacksmith's steel. The bar was old iron. He was not trying to cut through it. He was working on the rusted mortar that held it in place. The fire raged. It was a beautiful, terrifying thing. The whole town was there, a line of silhouettes passing useless buckets of water. Silas Kincaid was there, his face a mask of apoplectic fury, screaming at the men to save his horses, his profit, his investment. No one was watching the jail. The mortar gave way with a low, crumbling sound. Chayton pulled the bar free. The opening was impossibly small, but it was enough. He was not a thick man. He was a lean man, built of rope and wire. He slid his shoulders through, his shirt tearing, the stone scraping his ribs raw. He dropped, silent as a cat, into the alley behind the jail. He was a shadow, like Tommy. He moved along the backs of the buildings, his bare hands and moccasined feet making no sound. He reached the edge of town, where the dark prairie began. A horse was waiting, held by a tall, grim Comanche man. It was Paha, his father's oldest friend, the warrior who had been his teacher. Paha said nothing. He just handed Chayton the reins of the black warhorse, and a belt with a holstered pistol and a long knife. Chayton swung into the saddle. He was a prisoner no more. He was a warrior. He was an outlaw. He knew if he was caught again, there would be no cell, no marshal, no trial. He would be shot on sight. He spurred the horse, not toward the burning town, but toward the dark, sacred safety of his valley, his people already gathering, his blood on fire. Elizabeth did not drive to the ranch. She rode to the Cottonwood Creek, the place where they had agreed to meet. She had 2 horses, her bony mare and the blacksmith's finest gelding. She had a bag of food, pressed into her hands by Mrs. Miller, who had stared at her with tear-filled, grateful, and terrified eyes. "God bless you, miss," the woman had whispered. "You saved my boy. I do not care what they say. You are a good woman." She waited, her heart a drum against her ribs. She saw the fire, she heard the shouts, and she prayed. He came, not from the town, but from the darkness, a ghost on a black horse, flanked by Paha. He reined in, his face a hard, unreadable mask in the starlight. "I told you to go," he said, his voice a low growl. "You knew I would not," she said, handing him the reins of the blacksmith's horse. "You will need a fresh mount. We must ride." He looked at her. She was no longer Elizabeth Hart, the schoolteacher from Philadelphia. She was a woman in trousers, her face smudged with soot, her eyes blazing with a defiant fire. She had left her old life burning in the livery stable, just as he had left his cell. "They will call you an outlaw's woman," he said, his voice rough. "A traitor to your race." "I have been called worse," she said, swinging onto her mare. "Let us ride before the sheriff discovers his fire was not the only thing that escaped." Paha looked at the white woman, for the first time. He smiled, It was a fierce, sharp smile, like a wolf's. She has a warrior's heart. Quana. They rode, not as three, but as a small, desperate army, into the heart of the valley. For 2 days. They were ghosts. Chayton knew his land, every gully, every cave, every hidden spring. He and his small band of loyal hands, now numbering 20, moved like the wind, never sleeping in the same place twice. They were preparing for a siege. On the 3rd day, one of his scouts, a young man named Little Bear, rode in, his horse lathered. "I found it," Little Bear said, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe. "I found the tracks, the strange tracks, the ones that did not smell right." "Where?" Chayton asked. "In the North Canyon, the one the white men called Dead Man's Draw. It is a camp, not a trapper's camp, a strange camp." Chayton, Paha, and Elizabeth rode out, guided by Little Bear. They left their horses a mile away and approached on foot, crawling on their bellies over a high ridge. What they saw below made Elizabeth's stomach turn. It was a narrow, hidden canyon, a perfect natural prison. At the mouth, a rough stockade had been built. Inside were at least a dozen cages, built of heavy raw timber. In the cages were wolves. There were 3 pups, whining and pacing, their ribs stark beneath their fur. In a larger pen, a massive female wolf, her fur matted with filth, lay on her side, a heavy chain on her neck. Her eyes were dull, but full of a weary, ancient hate. 3 white men, rough-looking men in Kincaid's employ, were in the camp. They were gathered around a fire, drinking coffee. Nearby, the carcass of a deer was hung, and barrels of what looked like blood and offal were stacked against the canyon wall. "They are not trapping them," Paha whispered, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "They are raising them." Chayton said nothing. His eyes were on the men, the cages, the barrels. He saw, on a crude table, several small, dark glass vials. "This is the source," Chayton said, his voice cold as ice. "This is his weapon." "What do you mean?" Elizabeth asked. "They are not wild," Chayton said. "Look at the mother. She is chained. They are breeding them. The pups are starving. They are kept hungry. And the vials," he pointed. "They feed them blood mixed with laudanum, or strychnine. They drive them mad. They make them fearless. They are not natural wolves. They are Kincaid's hunting dogs." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. The stagecoach, the attack on Jeb Stone, it was all a performance, a grotesque play staged by Silas Kincaid. The real wolf was the man in the suit. "We kill them now," Paha said, his hand already on his knife. "We kill them, and we burn this place." "No," Elizabeth said, her voice sharp. Paha turned, his eyes full of contempt. "This is not a woman's place. This is war." "This is evidence," Elizabeth shot back, her fear replaced by a cold, hard anger. "If we kill them, we are just more savages in his story. We become the murderers he says we are. We need them alive. We need the camp. We need proof." Paha looked at Chayton. "She speaks, but my knife speaks louder." Chayton was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the camp. He looked at the chained mother wolf, her eyes mirroring the caged feeling in his own heart. "She is right," Chayton said. Paha recoiled as if struck. "We do not need revenge." Chayton continued, his voice low and hard. "We need justice. Paha, Little Bear. You will circle. You will take the 2 men to the fire. I will take the one by the cages. We take them alive, quietly." He looked at Elizabeth. "You will stay here." "I will not," she said. "I have a rifle. I'm a good shot. What if one gets away?" Chayton looked at her, at the iron in her spine. He nodded. "You will stay here, but you will watch. If one man runs past you, you will stop him." The attack was a silent, brutal ballet. Chayton and his men moved like snakes, shadows detaching from shadows. Before the men at the fire could even put down their coffee mugs, Paha and Little Bear were on them, knives at their throats, hands over their mouths. The 3rd man, who was prodding the mother wolf with a stick, heard nothing. Chayton came up behind him, the butt of his pistol rising and falling in one swift, economical arc. The man collapsed without a sound. It was over in 10 seconds. They tied the 3 men to a tree. Paha was furious, but obedient. Chayton strode into the camp, his face a mask of cold disgust. He found what he was looking for in a small, locked chest under the men's cots. It was a ledger and a map. Elizabeth came down into the camp, her rifle held ready. She joined Chayton as he opened the book. It was all there, shipments of laudanum, payments to the men, a map, with X's marking the location of the stagecoach accident and Jeb Stone's ranch, and, at the bottom of each page, the neat, precise signature of Silas Kincaid. "We have him," Elizabeth whispered, her hand on Chayton's arm. "We have paper," Chayton said, his voice grim. "It is not the same." He looked at the 3 bound men. "One of you will talk to the marshal." "Who will it be?" The men, their faces white with terror, stared at him. "You, Paha," Chayton said. "Take the other 2. Take them to the high ridge. Leave them there. No horses, no water. Let them walk home." "Quana," Paha protested. "This is not our way. This is the new way," Chayton said. "We will not stain our hands with this. We will give the marshal his proof. Go." Paha, his face a mask of thunder, obeyed. He dragged the 2 terrified men away. Chayton turned to the one remaining captive, a weasel-faced man with shifting eyes. "You," Chayton said, "you will carry this book, and you will walk with us, and you will tell Marshal Davis everything you know." He then walked to the large cage. The mother wolf inside growled, her teeth bared, her body low to the ground. "Elizabeth," he said, "stand back." He raised his rifle, and for a moment, Elizabeth thought he would kill the animal. Instead, he aimed at the heavy iron lock on the chain. He fired. The shot echoed through the canyon like a cannon. The lock shattered. The chain fell away. He then went to the cage door and raised the heavy bar. The door swung open. The mother wolf did not move. She stared at him, her yellow eyes full of suspicion and a deep, wild wisdom. "Go," Chayton whispered, speaking to her in his own language. "Take your children. The valley is yours again." He backed away, his hands raised, showing he was no threat. The wolf stood, her muscles trembling. She walked slowly out of the cage, a queen reclaiming her throne. She went to the smaller cage, nudged it with her nose, and let out a low bark. The pups inside yelped in reply. Chayton turned and walked out of the canyon, not looking back. He, Elizabeth, and their single, trembling captive began the long walk back to the horses. News of the jailbreak had sent Dusty Ford into a tailspin. News of the burning livery stable, and the fact that its owner, Silas Kincaid, had been screaming about his financial losses, had divided the town. But when Paha and the 2 bound men straggled in, half dead from thirst, telling a wild story of a wolf prison and a madman's plot, Silas knew he was finished, unless he acted. He did not wait. He used the jailbreak as his ultimate weapon. "He has broken out," Silas roared, standing on the steps of the saloon, a rifle in his hand. "The savage, Chayton Blackhorse, has murdered his guards, burned our town, and fled to the hills. He's gathering his warriors. He's coming to burn us all." It was a lie, but it was a powerful one. "I am deputizing every man in this town," Silas shouted, throwing open a crate of new rifles. "We are riding to Wolf Valley. We are not just hunting a man. We are fighting for our homes, for our women, for our lives. We will burn him out, and we will take back the valley that is rightfully ours." The sheriff, his authority gone, stood meekly by, handing out the guns. The men, caught in a fever of panic and bloodlust, took them far away in the valley. A single high, clear howl echoed from the ridges. The mother wolf was free. Chayton and Elizabeth stood on the high ridge, the same one where they had watched the camp. They could see the lights, a long, slow-moving river of torches, like a fiery snake, crawling out of Dusty Ford and heading for their valley. "He is coming," Elizabeth said, her voice quiet. "He has always been coming," Chayton replied. The wind was rising, pulling at her hair, and the air was thick with the scent of ozone. A new storm was brewing. He looked at her, his face grim in the pale starlight. "This is not your fight. Elizabeth, not anymore. Take the horse. Ride east. Do not stop until you reach the river." "No," she said, her voice as steady as the stone beneath their feet. "Tomorrow," he said. "One of us or all of us will die here. I will not have your death on my soul." "My death is my own," she said, her hand finding him in the dark. "My life is my own, and it is here, with you. If we live together. If we die here. Protecting this." He turned and gripped her arms, his fingers biting into her flesh. He looked at her, at the absolute, terrifying, beautiful certainty in her eyes. "I will not hide you," he said. "I will not make you a wife who serves in the lodge. You will stand with me. You will be a warrior, with me." "I am a teacher," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "And I am a warrior, and I am yours." He pulled her to him, a desperate, final embrace, a promise made in the facet of the apocalypse. Far below, the river of torches crept closer, and from the high ridges, answering the wind, came the howl of the free wolves, singing their song of the coming battle. The mouth of Wolf Valley was a natural bottleneck, a narrow pass between two sheer, rocky bluffs. Chayton and his 20 warriors were not hidden. They sat on their horses in a single, silent line, blocking the entrance. They were not painted for war. They were dressed as ranchers, their rifles held across their saddles. They were not invaders. They were defenders. The river of torches stopped. The mob, 50 or 60 strong, milled in the flat land just outside the pass. They were a mix of Kincaid's hired guns, drunken saloon patrons, and a few genuinely terrified townsfolk who had been swept up in the panic. Silas Kincaid rode to the front, alongside the sheriff. He raised a speaking trumpet. "Chayton Blackhorse," his voice boomed, metallic and false. "You are harboring a fugitive. You are accused of murder, arson, and insurrection. Send out the white woman and surrender yourself, and your men will be spared." The line of Comanche warriors sat as still as stone. Chayton kicked his black horse forward. He stopped 10 paces in front of his men, a lone figure in the torchlight. He did not shout. His voice, calm and clear, carried on the rising wind. "Silas Kincaid," he called. "You are a liar, and you are a murderer. You are the man who killed Jeb Stone. You are the man who lured the wolves to the stagecoach, killing 4 people. You are the man who has been terrorizing this territory to steal land." A nervous murmur went through the mob. This was not the confession of a savage. This was a direct, clear accusation. Kincaid laughed, a short, barking sound. "He is mad. He is buying time. He thinks his warriors can frighten us men. He is one man. The valley is ours. The land is ours. Forward, take him." He fired his own pistol into the air. The shot was the spark. From the rocks above, Paha, who was not in the line, fired an answering shot. It did not hit a man. It hit the speaking trumpet in Kincaid's hand, sending it spinning from his grasp with a metallic shriek. The battle for Wolf Valley had begun. It was not a charge. It was a panicked, disorganized firefight. Kincaid's mob, drunk and terrified, began firing wildly at the line of Comanche. The Comanche, disciplined, dismounted and took cover behind the rocks, their return fire precise, aimed at weapons, at horses, not at men. And then the sky tore open. It was not a rainstorm. It was a biblical deluge, a solid, vertical wall of water mixed with hail. The wind did not howl. It shrieked, a physical, tangible thing that tore torches from men's hands, extinguishing them, plunging the pass into a chaos of near-total darkness, lit only by the strobing, epileptic flashes of lightning. The thunder was not a rumble. It was a crack, an explosion, as if the mountains themselves were splitting apart. The human fight, so loud and important seconds before, was dwarfed. Men cowered, their rifles useless, their loyalties forgotten. The world had become a vortex of noise, wind, and freezing water. And into this vortex came a new army. A howl, high and clear, cut through the thunder. It was not a single voice. It was a pack, from the ridges above, driven mad by the storm, by the gunfire, by the smell of blood and ozone, came the wolves. It was the mother wolf, the one Chayton had freed, and her family. But she was not alone. She had been joined by other packs, the wild, free wolves of the valley, displaced and enraged. They were not weapons, they were nature's judgment. They did not choose a side. They fell upon the battle as a third, chaotic force. They poured down the rocks, a tide of gray shadow and yellow eyes, and they hit the mob's flank. A man screamed as a dark shape leaped, its jaws closing on his shoulder. A horse, its eyes white with terror, reared and fell, crushing its rider. The wolves were everywhere. phantoms in the lightning, attacking the mob, the horses, and any of the Comanche warriors who were in their path. The battle for the valley was no longer a battle. It was a rout. It was chaos. Men were screaming, running, firing their guns at shadows, in the rain, at each other. Elizabeth was not on the ridge. She was at the heart of it. When the shooting started, she had taken her horse, not to the rear but to a small, sheltered game warden's cabin, a tiny, one-room structure built into the side of the bluff, which she and Chayton had designated as a field hospital. She was not a warrior. She was a teacher, and she was a healer. She saw a man go down, one of Kincaid's hired guns, his leg shattered by a ricochet. He lay in the mud, screaming, as a wolf circled him. Elizabeth ran from the cabin, waving a burning branch she had pulled from the small hearth. "Get back!" she shrieked, her voice tearing from her throat. She thrust the fire at the wolf's face. The animal snarled, surprised by this small, furious creature, and retreated. Elizabeth grabbed the man by the collar of his coat. "You have to move," she grunted, her body straining. She dragged him, his leg leaving a dark trail in the mud, back to the cabin. She propped him against the wall, tore a strip from her own petticoat, and began to tie a tourniquet, her hands sure and steady. "But you are the man stammered, his face pale with shock. "I am the teacher," she said, her voice hard. "And you are bleeding. Be quiet." She ran back out. The storm was at its peak. She saw the blacksmith, Mr. Henderson, on his knees, his face ashen. He was not with Kincaid's men. He'd come to try and stop them. A stray bullet had grazed his temple. She pulled him to his feet. "To the cabin. Mr. Henderson, you are no good to anyone dead." She became a fixed point in the chaos. She was not a white woman. She was not the Indians' woman. She was a life force. She moved through the mud, the rain, and the wolves. Her small, determined figure, a beacon. She pulled a young Comanche warrior, his arm broken, to the same shelter as the hired gun. She tore strips from her dress, from the spare blankets, binding wounds, offering sips of water, her voice low and steady, a counterpoint to the storm. She was not fighting a war. She was saving the world, one life at a time, high above the chaos, on the slick, wind-scoured edge of the bluff. The two leaders met. Chayton had seen Silas Kincaid break from the mob, his horse scrambling up a narrow game trail, trying to get above the fight, to rally his men. Chayton had followed, his black horse moving like a goat over the treacherous rock. They faced each other on a ledge no wider than a wagon. Below them, the battle, the storm, and the wolves raged. A scene from a nightmare. "It is over, Kincaid," Chayton roared over the wind. "Your army is broken." "It is never over," Silas screamed, his face a mask of insane fury, his fine suit soaked and plastered to his body. "You think you have won. You have nothing. I have the law. I have the railroad contracts. I have the territorial governor in my pocket. You are just a savage with a fast horse. The law is on my side." "Your law is a piece of paper you use to wipe your feet," Chayton replied, his own rifle leveled. "You are a murderer. You have no law. You have no honor. You are nothing but a ghost." "I am the future," Silas shrieked. "And you are the past." He raised his pistol to fire. "Hold your fire, in the name of the United States government. I said, hold your fire." The voice was iron. Marshal Davis, flanked by two armed men in army blue, stepped onto the ledge from the trail behind Silas. His duster was soaked, his hat gone, but the star on his chest was visible, and the double-barreled shotgun in his hands was steady. And behind him, holding a lantern high, was Elizabeth. She had seen them go up the trail. She had taken her captive, the weasel-faced man from the wolf camp, and gone straight to the marshal, who had been trying to organize a line of defense for the town, separate from Kincaid's mob. "He is on the bluff. Marshal," Elizabeth had shouted, "and I have the proof he is the one you want now." On the ledge, in the driving rain, the final act played out. "Silas Kincaid," the marshal boomed, "you are under arrest for the murders of Jebediah Stone and the passengers of the overland stage. You are under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and incitement to riot." Silas looked from the marshal, to Chayton, to Elizabeth. His eyes landed on the weasel-faced man, who was cowering behind the marshal. clutching Kincaid's own ledger book. He was finished. The law, his law, had turned on him. He smiled. It was a terrible, rotting smile. "If I am finished," he whispered, "then so are you." He did not aim for the marshal. He did not aim for Chayton. He raised his pistol and fired. Point blank, at Elizabeth. It was a shot of pure, spiteful evil. Chayton did not think. He lunged. He did not lunge to attack Silas. He lunged to cover Elizabeth. His body hit hers, a solid, desperate impact, pushing her back, out of the line of fire. The bullet, meant for her heart, tore through the thick muscle of Chayton's shoulder. He roared, a sound of pure agony, and stumbled, his balance gone. Silas, seeing his chance, threw his empty pistol and charged, his shoulder hitting Chayton's wounded side, driving him toward the edge of the cliff. The two men, locked in a final embrace, teetered on the slick, black rock. Below them was a 300-foot drop into the raging, flooded creek. Silas was screaming, his fingers like claws, trying to push Chayton over, but Chayton, wounded and bleeding, was stronger. With a surge of pure, primal strength, he broke Silas's grip. He got his footing. He grabbed Silas by the front of his fine, ruined coat. He held him, dangling, his boots slipping. Over the abyss, one push, one release of his fingers, and it was over. Revenge, justice, it was his. "No!" Elizabeth screamed. She was on her knees, her hands outstretched. "Chayton, no, do not. If you kill him, you become him. You become the savage he says you are. The law will hang you. You will lose everything. Please let the law have him. Let us win." Chayton stared at her, his face a mask of agony and rage. He looked at the man in his grip, the man who had tried to destroy his people, who had tried to kill the woman he loved. He looked at the screaming, terrified face of Silas Kincaid, a man reduced to a pathetic, begging animal. He saw the truth. Killing him was not a victory. It was a different kind of cage, with a final, ragged groan. Chayton hauled Silas back, up from the edge, and threw him, like a sack of wet grain, at the marshal's feet. "He is yours!" Chayton panted, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Marshal Davis, his face a mask of profound respect, nodded. He kicked the pistol away from Kincaid and snapped the iron cuffs on his wrists, the same cuffs that had been on Chayton's. "It is over, Mr. Kincaid," the marshal said. "You are the defendant now." As the cuffs clicked shut, the storm broke, as if a switch had been thrown. The wind died. The lightning ceased, and the deluge softened to a steady, cleansing rain. Below, the fighting had stopped. The mob, seeing their leader captured, seeing the wolves melting back into the hills, threw down their guns. They stood, dazed, wet, and deeply ashamed, in the mud. Chayton's warriors did not cheer. They simply stood, their rifles lowered, watching as the new fragile peace settled over their valley. The valley was not given back. It was shared. In the days that followed, Marshal Davis, with Elizabeth as his chief witness and Kincaid's ledger as his proof, cleaned out Dusty Ford. The sheriff was arrested. The land company's charter was revoked. A new treaty was drawn, not in Washington, but in the valley itself, between Chayton, as the leader of his people, and Marshal Davis, as the arm of the law. Wolf Valley was declared a protected territory, jointly administered. The Comanche would hold their sacred lands. The central meadows would be communal grazing, open to all, including the ranchers who had stood against Kincaid. The wolf, the marshal declared, was part of that land, and would be protected as such. And on the rise, at the edge of the valley, a new, proper schoolhouse would be built, funded by the territorial government and the assets seized from Silas Kincaid. The war was over. The sky was a pale, washed blue, and the air smelled of damp earth, wet pine, and wood smoke. Elizabeth stood in the center of the meadow, the mud squelching under her boots. She was watching the place where the new school would be. She heard him approach, his steps slow, his arm was in a sling, her own white linen binding it. He stood beside her, not touching, just breathing the same clean air. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the land heal. "You saved my life," he said, his voice quiet. "You saved mine," she replied. "I almost killed him." "But you did not," she said. She turned to him. "You chose, Chayton. You chose us." He looked at her, his eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, now clear and open and full of a light she had never seen. "We won. We won," she agreed. He reached out his good hand, and she took it. Their fingers interlaced, and from the high ridges, far off, came the sound. A long, clear, triumphant howl. It was not a sound of menace. It was not a threat. It was the sound of the valley, wild and free and whole. It was the sound of home. The federal courthouse in Fort Smith was a building of red brick and stern judgment, a place where the chaotic violence of the frontier was distilled into the cold, hard ink of the law. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale tobacco, sweat, and the heavy wool of men's suits. It was a far cry from the open wind of Wolf Valley, but for 3 days, it had been the battleground where the final war was fought. Silas Kincaid sat at the defendant's table. The arrogance that had worn like a second skin in Dusty Ford was gone, stripped away by the sterile light of the courtroom. He looked smaller, his fine suit wrinkled, his silver hair dull. He was no longer the king of the county. He was just a man who had bet everything on fear and lost. Elizabeth Hart sat in the witness chair. She wore a simple dress of dark blue wool, her hands folded calmly in her lap. The bruises from the night of the siege had faded, but the steel in her spine had only hardened. She faced the jury. 12 men who looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, a schoolteacher who rode with Comanche warriors, a woman who had lived in a cabin with a savage. But when she spoke, the skepticism died. "Mr. Kincaid did not just steal land," Elizabeth said, her voice clear and carrying to the back of the room. "He stole the truth. He took the natural fear of the wilderness and he twisted it. He took wolves, noble animals that belonged to the land, and he tortured them until they were monsters. He took the prejudices of a town and fanned them until good neighbors were ready to become murderers." She looked directly at Silas. "He tried to kill Chayton Blackhorse not because Mr. Blackhorse was a criminal, but because he was the only man strong enough to stand in the way of Mr. Kincaid's greed." The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man from Washington who had read Marshall Davis's report with growing fury, laid the ledger on the table. It was the damning evidence, the book of blood and money Elizabeth and Chayton had seized from the Wolf camp. "This ledger," the prosecutor said, tapping the cover, "details payments for laudanum, for hired guns, and for the orchestrated attacks on the stagecoach. It is signed by the defendant." Then came the witnesses. Tommy, scrubbed clean and wearing a suit 2 sizes too big, told the court how he had delivered messages and seen the sheriff taking bribes. The weasel-faced man from the camp, terrified of the hangman's noose, spilled everything, describing in gruesome detail how Kincaid had ordered the starvation of the pups. And finally, Chayton took the stand. He did not wear a suit. He wore his buckskins and a clean linen shirt, his arm still in a sling. He did not swear on the Bible. He gave an affirmation to speak the truth. He answered the questions with a quiet, terrifying dignity. He did not speak of revenge. He spoke of the treaties his father had signed. He spoke of the law that Kincaid had violated. He showed the jury that the savage in the room was not the man with the braids, but the man in the silk cravat. The verdict took less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Murder in the first degree. Conspiracy. Fraud. When the judge read the sentence death by hanging for the murder of the stagecoach passengers, Silas Kincaid did not scream. He simply slumped in his chair, a puppet whose strings had finally been cut. The ride back to Dusty Ford was long, but the air felt different. The heavy, oppressive cloud of fear that had hung over the territory for a year had lifted. The system that Kincaid had built crumbled with his fall. The sheriff was stripped of his badge and locked in his own cell, awaiting trial for corruption. The territorial governor, eager to distance himself from the scandal, launched an immediate investigation into the land company. But the biggest change was with the railroad. 2 weeks after the trial, a private car pulled into the siding at the depot. 3 men in expensive suits emerged. They did not go to the saloon. They hired a buckboard and drove out to the ranch of Chayton Blackhorse. They sat on his porch, drinking coffee that Elizabeth poured. "Mr. Blackhorse," the lead surveyor said, a man who looked at Chayton with a newfound respect. The company regrets the actions of our former associate. Mr. Kincaid, we wish to renegotiate the right-of-way through the valley. There will be no tracks in the valley, Chayton said. He sat in a rocking chair, his wounded shoulder stiff but healing. The valley is sacred. It is protected land now. Marshal Davis has seen to that. The surveyor frowned. But the grade going around the mountains will cost us $50,000. Then it will cost you $50,000, Chayton said, taking a sip of his coffee. Or you can explain to the federal government why you wish to violate a treaty that has just been upheld by a federal court. The surveyor looked at Chayton, then at Elizabeth, who stood by the railing, watching with a small smile. He realized he was not dealing with a naive native. He was dealing with a man who knew the value of his land and had the power to hold it. Very well, the surveyor sighed. We will go around. It was a victory more profound than the gunfight. It was the victory of sovereignty. The town of Dusty Ford was quieter now. The shame of the mob hung over it. A collective hangover. People walked with their heads down. When they saw Chayton ride in, they did not jeer. They stepped aside, tipping their hats in a tentative, apologetic way. They had been ready to kill an innocent man, and the knowledge sat heavy in their bellies. But the center of the healing was the schoolhouse. The warehouse was gone. In its place, on a rise of land that sat exactly on the border between the town and the valley, a new building was rising. It was built of white pine and sturdy oak. It had large windows to let in the light. It was funded by the assets seized from Silas Kincaid's estate. Elizabeth stood in the doorway of the unfinished structure, watching the children play in the yard. It was a sight that would have been impossible a month ago. Ben Miller was chasing a ball. Running right beside him was Little Bear's younger brother. There were white children, Comanche children, and the mixed-blood children who had once hidden in the shadows. They were shouting, laughing, tumbling in the grass, oblivious to the lines their parents had drawn in the dirt. Elizabeth felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Chayton. He was watching the children, and the hard lines of his face, usually so guarded, were soft. They do not see the difference, he said quietly. Not yet, Elizabeth answered. And it is our job to make sure they never do. She looked at him. The school board met yesterday. The new board, Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Miller. And they have asked me to be the principal, she said. A permanent position with a contract. And they agreed to the condition. The school is open to all. No tuition, no exclusion. Chayton nodded slowly. Then you have built your bridge, Elizabeth. We built it, she corrected. She stepped out onto the porch, into the sunlight. There were people watching from the road. Mrs. Gable was there, clutching her shawl. A few of the ranchers who had ridden with the mob were there. Elizabeth did not shrink. She reached out and took Chayton's hand. It was a simple gesture, but in Dusty Ford, in the year 1880, it was a revolution. She interlaced her fingers with his, the white hand and the red hand, the teacher and the warrior. She saw Mrs. Gable stiffen. She saw a few men turn away, but she also saw Mrs. Miller's smiles and waves. She saw Mr. Henderson tip his hat, and she saw the children stop their game and cheer. They walked down the steps and onto the main road, hand in hand, walking not with defiance, but with a calm, absolute certainty. They were not asking for permission. They were stating a fact. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges. They walked to the edge of the creek, near the cottonwood trees where she had first ridden to join him. The water ran clear and cold over the stones. Chayton stopped. He let go of her hand and reached into the pocket of his vest. I have something, he said. He seemed suddenly unsure, the confidence of the courtroom and the battlefield gone. He pulled out a piece of cloth. Inside was a ring. It was not a diamond from a city store. It was silver, hammered and shaped by hand. It was etched with the design of running water and mountains. In the center was set a small, polished piece of turquoise, blue as the winter sky. My father made this, he said, looking at the ring rather than her. For my mother. It has been on the earth for a long time. I dug it up before the trial. He looked up, his black eyes searching hers. I have lost everything once. Elizabeth, I have buried a wife. I have buried a son. I have seen my world turn to ash. I promised myself I would never love anything again, because to love is to give the world a hostage. He took a step closer. But you walked into the fire. You stood in the storm. You saved my life. But more than that, you saved my heart. You made me remember who I am. He took her hand, his touch rough and warm. I am a man of two worlds. I cannot promise you an easy life. There will be whispers. There will be hate. But I can promise you this valley. I can promise you my protection. And I can promise you that as long as I draw breath, you will never be alone. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Elizabeth Hart, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Do you want to call this place home with me? Elizabeth looked at the ring, then at the man. She saw the scars of his past, the strength of his present, and the hope of their future. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Chaitin, forever. He pulled her into his arms, and they stood by the creek as the sun died. Two survivors who had found the only thing worth fighting for. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, on the first day of spring. It was held in the meadow at the mouth of the valley, beneath the open sky. It was a ceremony that Dusty Ford had never seen and would never forget. There was a minister, a circuit rider with a dusty black coat and a kind face, who read from the Bible. He spoke of love being patient and kind, of two becoming one flesh, and there was Paha, standing tall in his ceremonial buckskins, holding a sacred eagle feather. He spoke to the four directions, to the earth and the sky, calling upon the spirits of the land to bless the union. The guests were a tapestry of the new frontier. On one side stood the children of the school, scrubbed and shining. Mrs. Miller stood with them, weeping openly. Mr. Henderson and the new sheriff stood respectfully. Even Tommy was there, standing next to Chaitin as his best man, looking fierce and proud. On the other side stood the Comanche, the warriors who had held the pass, the women who had returned to the valley. They wore their finest beaded clothes, their face solemn and welcoming. Elizabeth wore a dress of cream-colored lace, sewn by the women of the town who had silently come to her aid in the weeks after the trial, but around her neck, she wore a necklace of silver and bone, a gift from Paha's wife. Chaitin wore a black suit, tailored and sharp, but on his feet were moccasins, and his hair was braided with red ribbon. They stood before the fire that Paha had built. The minister asked for the vows. I, Elizabeth, take thee. Chaitin, I, Chaitin, take thee. Elizabeth. Then, Paha stepped forward. He took a strip of soft, white doeskin leather. He directed them to clasp their hands over the fire. He wound the leather around their wrists, binding them together. Now you are tied, Paha said in English, his voice raspy. Your breath is one breath. Your path is one path. The fire witnesses it. The wolf witnesses it. The people witnessed it. Chaitin looked at Elizabeth. The leather bound their pulses together. He could feel her heart beating against his wrist. Married her forever, he whispered, a private echo of the promise he had made to himself the night of the storm. Forever, she answered. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not the desperate kiss of the cabin, nor the tentative kiss of the creek. It was a kiss of claiming, of joy, of absolute, public union. A cheer went up. It was a ragged, mixed sound, the polite applause of the townspeople, the high yips of the Comanche warriors, the shouting of the children. Chaitin raised his bound hand, pulling Elizabeth with him, and turned to face the crowd. They were husband and wife. They were the bridge. The sun went down, and the celebration continued in the valley. There was fiddling and drumming. There was beef and venison. Two cultures, wary but willing, ate at the same fires, but Chaitin and Elizabeth slipped away. They rode to the cabin, the original cabin, deep in the hills. It had been repaired, expanded. A new room was added, but the heart of it was the same. Inside, Chaitin had already laid the fire. The room was warm, smelling of pine and sage. He shut the door, barring it against the world. The silence was heavy and sweet. He turned to her. He did not rush. He reached out and gently unbuttoned the high collar of her lace dress. My wife, he said, the word sounding new and reverent on his tongue. My husband, she replied, her hands resting on his chest. He lifted her, carrying her to the bed that was covered in soft furs and clean linen. The firelight danced on the walls, casting long, intimate shadows. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, a soft, protecting sound. And then, from far up on the ridge, it came. A howl. It was the mother wolf. She was singing. It was not a cry of hunger. It was a song of the pack, a song of family, a song of the night. Elizabeth lay back, pulling Chayton down to her. She felt his weight, his warmth, the solid reality of him, the fear of the past, the judgment of the town, the terror of the wolves. It was all gone. She was safe. She was loved. She was home. They came together in the firelight, two souls who had crossed a wasteland to find each other. As the wolf sang them to sleep, there was no white, no red, no savage, no civilized. There was only the man, the woman, and the love that had conquered the West. 5 years. In the West. 5 years was a lifetime. It was the space between a parched creek bed and a flood, between an open range and a barbed wire fence. For Wolf Valley, it was the space between a war and a home. The valley had changed, but it had not been broken. It had bent, like a willow in the wind, and found a new shape. The railroad, true to its word, now skirted the high northern rim, its whistle a distant, lonely cry in the afternoons, a sound no longer of invasion, but of connection to the world beyond. Wagon trails, hard-packed and wide, now led into the communal grazing lands where the herds of the Comanche and the white ranchers mixed, their brands the Black Horse Q and the Henderson H, a silent testament to the truce. But the high ridges, the sacred places, the deep woods where the streams were born, these remained untouched. They were given back to the land, to the deer, to the eagle, and to the wolf. The schoolhouse on the rise was the first thing a traveler saw, and the last. It was no longer a single pine-walled room. A new wing had been added, funded by a grant Elizabeth had written, in her neat copperplate hand, to a foundation in Boston. It had a bell tower, and a small library, and a porch that wrapped all the way around. From that porch, in the quiet of an evening, one could hear the sound that defined the new valley. It was not gunfire. It was the sound of children. The laughter that spilled from the schoolyard was a mix of languages, shouts in English, answers in Comanche, and a fluid, easy dialect in between that the children had invented themselves. They were all there, the sons of ranchers, the daughters of warriors, the children of the blacksmith, and the orphans of the town. They played tag, their moccasins and their scuffed boots kicking up the same dust. The house was 2 miles up the valley, set in a grove of cottonwoods by the main creek. The original hunting cabin still stood, its logs dark and seasoned. It was the heart of the home, the study, the place where Chayton kept his ledgers and Elizabeth kept her books. But a larger 2-story ranch house had been built around it, with a deep porch and wide windows. It was a house that was not afraid of the outside world. Inside, the light was fading. An oil lamp cast a warm, golden circle on the hearth. "And then," a small, bright voice demanded, "and then, Papa, tell the part about the big one, the one with the yellow eyes." "Abe," Elizabeth said, her voice smiling, "it is past your bedtime, and you know the story by heart. But I want Papa to tell me." Chayton Blackhorse, his arm no longer in a sling, but with a faint, silver scar still puckering the skin of his shoulder, looked down at the boy in his lap. Abraham Quanah Blackhorse was 4 years old. He had his mother's bright, intelligent blue eyes and his father's straight black hair. "The one with the yellow eyes," Chayton said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone. "He was brave, but he was hungry. And your mother—" He looked across the fire at Elizabeth, who was rocking their daughter, a 1-year-old named Willow, who had her mother's face and her father's quiet, watchful spirit. "Your mother," Chayton continued, his eyes still on his wife, "was braver. She was not afraid," Abe said, his small chest puffing with pride. "She was terrified," Chayton said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And she did it anyway. That is what bravery is. And you came on the black horse," Abe whispered, his eyes growing heavy. "And you had the fire, and the bow," Chayton finished for him. "And you saved her," Abe murmured, his head resting on his father's chest. "You saved Mama from the wolves." Chayton put his hand on his son's back, feeling the small, steady rhythm of his breathing. The story, which had been a night of terror and blood, had, over the years, been worn smooth by the telling. It was no longer a nightmare. It was a legend. It was the foundation myth of their family. He looked at Elizabeth, and she smiled at him over the head of their sleeping daughter. They were still, sometimes, a mystery to each other. He was still the man who would wake in the dark, his hand reaching for a weapon that was no longer there, the ghosts of his first family in his eyes. She was still the woman who, on rainy afternoons, would look at the eastern horizon with a faint, unnameable longing for the green hills of Philadelphia. But they had chosen. They had faced their ghosts and their longings, and they had chosen to build a new life from the wreckage of the old. They had not been erased by each other. They had been forged. The next morning, Chayton rode out, not as a warrior, but as a statesman. He was not just a rancher anymore. The federal government, in its slow, grinding way, had finally recognized that the man who had defeated Silas Kincaid was not an enemy, but a necessary ally. He was the official liaison, the Comanche agent, but one appointed by his own people, not by Washington. He sat in meetings with railroad men, army captains, and territorial governors. He negotiated grazing rights, timber rights, and, most importantly, the rights of his people to exist, not as prisoners, but as citizens. He was a harder bargain than any man in a suit, because he fought not for profit, but for survival, and he knew the white man's law better than the men who had written it. Elizabeth, too, had a new title. When she walked through Dusty Ford, people no longer saw the Indian woman. They saw Mrs. Blackhorse, the principal of the finest school in the territory. They saw the woman who had, by her own courage, saved the town from a war with the Comanche, and, perhaps more importantly, saved it from itself. She was a member of the new town board. She was the president of the literary society. She was, in every way, the heart of the community, a center of gravity, a force of civilization that was built not on exclusion, but on a fierce, unyielding compassion. The story of Silas Kincaid had become a dark legend, a cautionary tale told by men in the saloon, a lesson taught in the schoolhouse. He had died in a federal prison in Kansas, of a fever, alone and unmourned. His name was now just a line in a deed book, a warning about what happens when a man's greed outgrows his soul, and the wolves, the ones that had been his pawns, were the spirit of the valley. The children learned about them in Elizabeth's classroom. They learned that the wolf was not a demon. They learned that it was a hunter, and that it kept the deer herds healthy. They learned that it was a part of the land, a part of the balance. Abe and Willow had seen them from the high porch of the ranch. They had watched the pack move like gray smoke along a distant ridge. They did not see monsters. They saw their father's guardians, their mother's rescuers. They saw neighbors. In the late afternoon, the shadows grew long across the valley. Elizabeth finished her work at the schoolhouse and began the walk home. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and the first hint of autumn. She saw him on the ridge above the house, the one that looked out over the whole valley. He was not on his horse. He was standing, a tall, solitary figure, watching the sun set. She climbed the hill, her skirts brushing the dry grass. He heard her, and he turned, a smile touching his eyes. He was looking down at the schoolhouse, at the lights of Dusty Ford winking on in the distance, at the smoke rising from the lodges of his people further up the valley. "You are worried," she said, coming to stand beside him. "The world is coming," he said quietly, his gaze on the distant railroad line. "The wire fences, the new laws. It will not be easy." "No," she said, "it will not. It will be a fight, every day." He looked at her, his smile deepening. "And we are ready for it." He reached for her, and she stepped into his embrace, her head resting on his chest, her arms around his waist. He was solid, real, her anchor in this wild, beautiful, and dangerous world. He unwrapped the heavy wool blanket he had been carrying and draped it around her shoulders, pulling her close against the evening chill. It was the same gesture from their first, terrifying night in the cabin. the gesture of a protector, the gesture of a husband. They stood, wrapped in the same blanket, breathing the same air, their hearts beating as one. They watched the sky turn to a deep, bruised velvet. The last light of the sun flashed on the high ridges, and on the highest, furthest ridge, a dark shape stepped out against the sky. It raised its head, and a long, clear, silver howl floated down to them, a song of freedom, of family, of the unbroken wild. Chayton held his wife. Elizabeth leaned against her husband. They both smiled. The west was still wild, but between the howl of the wolf and the whistle of the train, they had found a word for home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We truly hope you enjoyed this tale of the wild frontier. This is a labor of love, and we are so grateful to have you here with us. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please, drop a comment below and tell us what part of the world you are in, and what you thought of Chayton and Elizabeth's journey. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider supporting us. Subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, for more stories like this one. Give this video a like, and if you really want to help us out, hit that hype button. It tells the algorithm that you loved this, and it helps our story be heard by more people. Thank you again for your time. We will see you in the next tale.